Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Moving to Maplewood was a decision I made quickly, almost impulsively. After living in a loud, bustling city for years, I wanted a change, a quiet place where I could focus on my work and enjoy some peace. Maplewood seemed perfect. It was a small town surrounded by lush forests, with quiet streets and friendly neighbors. I found a house on Pine Street, tucked at the end of a cul-de-sac. It wasn't huge, but it had everything I needed. A cozy living room, a decent kitchen, and an office space where I could work on my game projects. The best part? It had a backyard with a view of the woods. The day I moved in, the weather was warm and sunny. I had rented a small moving truck to bring my things over. By the time I started unloading boxes, I was drenched in sweat. The neighborhood was eerily silent, except for the occasional sound of birds chirping or a car passing by. As I carried a box labeled books up the driveway, I noticed someone across the street. A man was standing in his garage, tinkering with what looked like a toolbox. He was tall, with dark hair, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked up and waved when he saw me. "Hey there, new in town?" he called out. I put the box down and wiped my hands on my jeans before waving back. "Yeah, just moved in today." He smiled and started walking over. As he got closer, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, like I knew him from somewhere. "Ethan?" he said, his eyes lighting up. I squinted, trying to place him. "Yeah, that's me. Do we know each other?" "It's me, Alex Carter. We used to hang out all the time when we were kids." The name hit me like a ton of bricks. Alex Carter. How could I have not recognized him? Memories of summer afternoons riding bikes, playing soccer, and building forts in the woods flooded my mind. "Alex, wow, it's been, what, 15 years?" I exclaimed. "Something like that," he said, laughing. "Man, it's crazy to see you here. I never thought we'd run into each other again." We stood there for a moment, grinning like fools, before he clapped me on the shoulder. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said. "I live right over there." He pointed to the house next door. "Seriously? What are the odds?" I laughed. "I thought you moved out west after middle school." "I did," Alex said. "But my wife, Mia, and I decided to move back here a few months ago. Maplewood's a nice place to settle down." He asked me about my move, and I told him how I wanted a quieter environment for work. I explained that I was a game developer, working mostly from home. "Still into video games, huh?" Alex said, smirking. "You know it," I replied. "What about you? What have you been up to?" "Oh, you know, a little bit of this, a little bit of that," he said vaguely. "We should catch up properly sometime. Grab a beer or something." "Absolutely," I said. "Let me get settled in, and we'll set something up." As Alex walked back to his garage, I couldn't stop smiling. Of all the places in the world we'd ended up as neighbors, it felt like a good omen, a sign that this move was the right choice. The rest of the day was a blur of unpacking and organizing. By the time I finally sat down on my couch, the sun had set, and the streetlights outside cast a soft glow on the quiet street. I looked out the window at Alex's house. His porch light was on, and I could see him and Mia sitting on their front steps, talking and laughing. Seeing him brought back so many memories. Alex and I had been inseparable as kids. We'd spent countless hours playing video games, riding bikes, and exploring the woods behind our neighborhood. I remembered the time we tried to build a tree house and ended up falling out of the tree, laughing so hard we could barely breathe. But life had taken us in different directions. After Alex's family moved, we lost touch. We didn't have smartphones or social media back then, so keeping in contact wasn't easy. Over time, he became just a fond memory. Now, here he was, right next door. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to get more unpacking done. As I stepped outside to grab my morning coffee from the car, I saw Alex again. He was out for a jog, wearing headphones and a sweat-soaked tank top. "Morning," he called out, waving. "Morning," I replied. He jogged over, pulling out one of his earbuds. "How's the unpacking going?" "Slow but steady," I said, sipping my coffee. I didn't realize I had so much stuff. He laughed. "Yeah, moving's a pain. If you need help, just let me know." "Thanks. I appreciate it." As we chatted, I noticed a shadow move behind Alex's curtain. It must have been Mia. I hadn't officially met her yet, but from what Alex said, she seemed nice. "You should come over for dinner soon," Alex said. "Mia would love to meet you." "That sounds great," I said. "Let's plan something for next week." "Perfect," he said, putting his earbud back in. "I'll let you get back to it. See you around?" Over the next few days, I settled into my new routine. I spent my mornings working on my game projects and my evenings exploring the town. Maplewood was charming in its simplicity. There was a small diner on Main Street where the locals gathered, a park where kids played, and a library that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Every now and then, I'd see Alex and Mia around the neighborhood. They seemed like a happy couple, always smiling and chatting with neighbors. It felt good to have a familiar face nearby. One afternoon, as I was setting up my office, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, Alex was standing there, holding a plate of cookies. "Mia made these," he said, grinning. "Figured we'd welcome you to the neighborhood properly." "Thanks," I said, taking the plate. "Come on in." Alex stepped inside and looked around. "Nice setup," he said, nodding toward my computer. "You weren't kidding about being a game developer." "Yeah, this is where the magic happens," I said. We chatted for a bit, reminiscing about old times and catching up on each other's lives. Alex told me about his job as a handyman and how he and Mia were thinking about starting a family. "You know," he said, leaning back on the couch, "it's crazy how life works. One minute you're a kid riding bikes, and the next, you're an adult trying to figure it all out." "Tell me about it," I said, laughing. As the sun set, Alex headed home, leaving me with a warm feeling of nostalgia. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere, but that feeling wouldn't last. Life in Maplewood continued to feel idyllic, almost too perfect. Days went by quickly, filled with work, small errands, and the occasional chat with Alex. I was still in the honeymoon phase of settling into my new home. However, something about the quietness of Maplewood started to feel unnatural. One evening, about a week after Alex and Mia welcomed me with cookies, I decided to take a stroll through the neighborhood. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from the woods behind the cul-de-sac. Streetlights illuminated the road in soft, golden hues. Maplewood had a charm that I couldn't deny, but it was also the kind of place that made you hyper-aware of your surroundings. The silence wasn't like the kind I experienced in the city at night, filled with distant hums of traffic or occasional sirens. This was absolute silence, as if the world was holding its breath. As I walked past Alex's house, I noticed his front curtains drawn tightly shut. The porch light was on, but there was no sign of movement inside. I shrugged it off, figuring they were probably enjoying a quiet evening. When I turned the corner to explore a nearby street, I noticed something odd. A figure stood beneath a street lamp, their face obscured by the shadows. They didn't move or acknowledge me, just stood there. I slowed my pace, my heart beating a little faster. "Just another neighbor," I muttered under my breath. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided to turn back toward home, trying not to think about how the figure remained frozen under the street lamp. Back in the safety of my house, I locked the door and pulled the curtains closed. The night's unsettling encounter was still fresh in my mind as I turned on my computer and tried to distract myself with work. Developing video games had always been my escape. That night, I was working on a horror-themed level for a game I was designing. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I layered eerie sound effects and programmed dim lighting for the game, I felt the same unease creep back into the real world. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I stepped into the kitchen to grab a glass of water before bed. That's when I heard a faint noise, something scraping against the window. My grip tightened on the glass as I turned toward the sound. It was faint but unmistakable, like nails dragging against the glass. My pulse quickened as I slowly approached the window. I peeked through the curtain but saw nothing. The backyard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows dancing across the grass. It's probably just a branch, I told myself, trying to calm the rising panic. But as I stepped back from the window, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more deliberate. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and shone it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the backyard. Nothing. I sighed, shaking my head. "You're being paranoid," I muttered. Still, I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before heading upstairs. The next morning, I ran into Alex while taking the trash out. He was sitting on his porch, sipping coffee. "Morning," he called out. "Morning," I replied, hesitating for a moment. I debated whether to mention the strange noise from the night before, but decided against it. Instead, I said, "You guys were quiet last night. Everything okay?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, why?" "Just noticed your curtains were drawn. Figured you were having a quiet evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He chuckled. "Mia's been on this kick about privacy lately. Says she doesn't want the neighbors peeking in." I nodded, though something about his tone felt off. That evening, Alex and Mia invited me over for dinner. Their house was warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of roasted chicken and baked potatoes. Mia was kind and bubbly, the type of person who made you feel at ease instantly. As we ate, the conversation drifted toward old memories. Alex and I reminisced about our childhood adventures, from exploring the woods to building makeshift ramps for our bikes. "You guys were wild," Mia said, laughing. "I can't imagine Alex as the reckless type." "Oh, he was," I said, grinning. "We even got in trouble once for sneaking into that old abandoned factory." Alex's face darkened for a split second before he forced a laugh. "Yeah, those were the days." The shift in his mood was subtle, but I noticed. After dinner, Alex walked me home. The night air was crisp, and the streets were eerily quiet again. "Thanks for coming over," he said as we reached my driveway. "Of course. Dinner was great," I said. Alex hesitated, glancing back toward his house. "Hey, if you ever hear anything weird around here, let me know, okay?" I frowned. "Weird like what?" "Just anything out of the ordinary," he said, his voice low. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my unease growing. Yeah, he said quickly. "Just being neighborly." He gave me a tight smile before heading back to his house. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Alex's comment lingered in my mind as I worked in my office. Around 2 a.m., I decided to call it a night and was about to shut down my computer when I got a notification on my phone. Someone was at the front door. I froze, my heart racing as I opened the camera app linked to the motion detector. There, on my doorstep, was a figure wearing a hoodie. They stood motionless, their face obscured by the shadows. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who would be at my door at this hour? The figure leaned forward, as if inspecting the doorbell camera. I could see their hand reaching for the doorknob. My blood ran cold. I quickly turned on the porch light, hoping to scare them off. The figure flinched and stepped back, their face still hidden. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, they turned and ran off into the night. The next morning, I told Alex about the incident. "Someone was at your door? At 2 a.m.? He said, his brow furrowed. "Yeah," I said. "They didn't do anything, but it was weird." Alex's jaw tightened. "You should get some cameras installed if you haven't already." "I have one by the door," I said. "That's how I saw them." "Good," he said, his voice firm. "You can't be too careful around here." That day, I installed additional cameras around the house. One in the backyard, one on the side of the house, and another in the driveway. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I worked on my game that evening, I kept glancing at the camera feeds on my second monitor. Every rustle of leaves or passing car made my heart jump. It wasn't long before I got another notification. This time, it was the backyard camera. I clicked on the feed and saw movement near the tree line. A figure stood just at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by the shadows. I zoomed in, trying to get a better look, but the camera's resolution wasn't great in low light. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching. I stared at the grainy image on the monitor, my pulse thundering in my ears. The figure at the edge of the woods was too far away to make out any details, but their presence felt deliberate. They weren't wandering aimlessly, they were watching. I reached for my phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the Maplewood police. As I explained the situation, my voice wavered despite my efforts to stay calm. "Someone was in your backyard?" the dispatcher repeated, her tone professional but slightly skeptical. "Yes," I said. "They're standing near the woods, right at the edge of my property." "Are they on your property now?" I glanced back at the screen. The figure hadn't moved. "Yes, technically they're on the grass near the tree line. We'll send an officer to check it out," she assured me. "Stay inside and keep your doors locked." While I waited, I kept my eyes on the camera feed. The figure didn't budge, as if they were intentionally trying to unsettle me. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, the headlights of a patrol car illuminated my driveway. An officer stepped out, shining a flashlight into the backyard. I opened the front door and waved him over. "Evening," he said, his expression calm but alert. "You called about someone in your backyard?" "Yes, they were standing near the woods," I said, pointing toward the tree line. He nodded and headed toward the backyard, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I watched from the porch, anxiety gnawing at me. After a few minutes, he returned. "I didn't see anyone," he said, his tone measured, "but the ground near the woods shows some signs of recent activity. Footprints." I swallowed hard. "So, someone was there?" "Looks like it," he admitted. "I'd recommend keeping your cameras running and letting us know if anything else happens." I thanked him and locked the door behind him, double-checking every bolt and latch in the house. The following day, I tried to convince myself it was a prank, a neighborhood kid trying to spook the new resident. But deep down, I knew better. I spent most of the day installing additional lights around the house and tweaking the motion detection settings on the cameras. The lights were bright enough to make the backyard look like daylight at night. If anyone came near the house again, I'd see them. That evening, Alex stopped by. "Hey, just wanted to check in," he said, leaning against the porch railing. "Heard the police were here last night. Everything okay?" I hesitated, debating how much to share. "Someone was in my backyard," I finally said. "They were standing near the woods, just watching." Alex's expression darkened. "Did they do anything?" "No, they just stood there. But it was enough to freak me out." He nodded slowly. "The woods can be weird sometimes. People say they hear things out there at night. Strange noises." "What kind of noises?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Just Weird stuff, he said vaguely. Probably animals, but it doesn't always sound like it. I frowned, unsure whether to press him further. You ever see anyone out there? Alex hesitated, then shook his head. No, but I don't spend much time outside after dark. Just keep your cameras running and stay vigilant. That night, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept wandering to the figure in the woods. Around midnight, the backyard camera sent another notification. My stomach dropped as I clicked on the feed. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the yard was empty. But then I noticed something. A shadow moved near the edge of the woods. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I zoomed in, straining to see more clearly. The shadow moved again, this time stepping closer to the house. My breath caught as the figure emerged into the light. It was the same person from the night before, wearing a hooded sweatshirt. They stood motionless, staring directly at the camera. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone and called the police again. By the time the officer arrived, the figure was gone. This time, they hadn't lingered long enough to be caught. You need to stay indoors, the officer warned me. And if you see them again, don't confront them. Just call us immediately. I nodded, feeling a mix of frustration and fear. Whoever this was, they weren't just passing through. They were targeting me. The following morning, I decided to talk to Alex again. I found him in his garage, tinkering with his car. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. Can I ask you something? Sure, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Have you ever had issues with trespassers? Someone hanging around your property? Alex's face tightened. Why do you ask? They came back last night, I said. The same person. They were standing in my backyard again, staring at the camera. He set down the rag and leaned against the workbench. You're sure it's the same person? Positive, I said. They were wearing the same hoodie. Alex frowned, glancing toward the woods. I've heard of break-ins happening in the area, but this feels different. What do you mean? He hesitated, then said, It's probably nothing, but if I were you, I'd keep an eye on the woods. That evening, I took Alex's advice and decided to investigate the woods myself. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I ventured into the trees. The woods were dense, the canopy blocking out most of the light from the setting sun. My footsteps crunched against the fallen leaves, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. I scanned the area with my flashlight, looking for anything out of place. At first, it was just trees and shrubs, nothing unusual. But then I noticed something, a faint trail leading deeper into the woods. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air seemed colder here, and the silence was oppressive. Eventually, I came across a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was something that made my blood run cold. A crude structure, almost like a lean-to, made of branches and tarp. It looked hastily constructed, but it was clear someone had been staying here. Scattered around the makeshift shelter were empty food wrappers, a half-burned candle, and a notebook. I hesitated before picking up the notebook. The pages were filled with messy, erratic handwriting, but one phrase stood out. My hands trembled as I dropped the notebook. Whoever had written this knew about me. I ran back to my house, heart pounding. Once inside, I locked every door and window, my mind racing. Who was this person? And why were they targeting me? As I sat on the couch trying to make sense of everything, my phone buzzed. It was another notification from the backyard camera. I opened the app and froze. The figure was back, standing in the exact same spot as before. This time, they weren't alone. Two more figures stood beside them, both wearing dark clothing and masks. They stared at the camera, their heads tilted slightly, as if daring me to come outside. The sight of three figures standing in my backyard rooted me in place. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Unlike the previous encounters, this was no fleeting trespass. It was an unmistakable challenge. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? Why had they brought others this time? And what did they want from me? They stood motionless, their dark clothing blending into the night. The masks obscured their faces, but their body language radiated menace. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Emergency services, what's your location? I rattled off my address, struggling to keep my voice steady. There are 3 people in my backyard, all wearing masks. They're just standing there, staring at my security camera. Are they attempting to break in? Not yet, I said, glancing back at the feed. The figures hadn't moved, but I think they're trying to intimidate me. They've been here before. Stay inside, lock all your doors, and do not engage, the operator instructed. Officers are on their way. The minutes stretched into an eternity as I waited for the police. I stayed glued to the monitor, my eyes darting between the figures. They didn't move, but their presence alone was enough to fill the house with an oppressive tension. Finally, red and blue lights flashed outside as a patrol car pulled into the driveway. The figures didn't scatter or run. Instead, they turned and calmly walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath and opened the door as 2 officers approached. "Good evening," one of them said, her voice calm but firm. "You reported trespassers?" "Yes," I said, motioning toward the backyard. They were standing right there near the edge of the woods, 3 of them, wearing masks. The officers exchanged a glance before heading to the backyard, flashlights in hand. I followed them as far as the back porch, my nerves on edge. The officers scanned the area, their beams slicing through the night. "They went into the woods," I said, pointing toward the tree line. One officer nodded and ventured closer, while the other stayed back to question me. "Have you seen these people before?" she asked. "Yes, one of them has been here twice before," I explained, my words tumbling out. "I think they've been watching me." "Have they tried to enter your home?" "Not yet," I said, though the thought made my skin crawl. "But they left footprints near my property before, and now there's 3 of them." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "We'll take a look in the woods and patrol the area. In the meantime, I recommend keeping your cameras running and staying vigilant." After the officers left, I tried to calm down, but the night felt suffocating. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, my imagination conjuring shadows where there were none. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed in the living room, the security feed open on my laptop and a baseball bat within reach. The next morning, I decided to investigate further. I needed answers, and waiting for another confrontation wasn't an option. I called Alex and told him everything. "They came back? With more people?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yeah, and they weren't just passing through. They stood there like they were daring me to do something." Alex was silent for a moment before saying, "Meet me at my place. I think it's time we talked." When I arrived at Alex's house, he was already waiting on the porch. His usual laid-back demeanor was replaced by a tense, serious expression. "Come inside," he said, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. Once inside, he motioned for me to sit at the kitchen table. "Look," he began, leaning forward. "I didn't want to freak you out before, but there's something you need to know about those woods." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Over the years, there have been rumors," he said. "People seeing strange things, lights in the trees, figures watching from the shadows. Some folks think it's just teenagers messing around, but others, they think it's something more sinister." "Like what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex hesitated. "There's this old story about a group that used the woods for rituals. Weird stuff. They'd mark trees with symbols and leave strange things behind. Nobody's ever proven it, but people in the neighborhood avoid the woods for a reason." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You think the people in my backyard are part of that group?" "It's possible," Alex said. "Or maybe they're just using the stories to scare people. Either way, you shouldn't go into the woods alone." I thought about the clearing I'd found, the makeshift shelter, and the notebook with its cryptic message. I already did, I admitted. And I found something. Alex's eyes widened. What did you find? I described the shelter in the notebook. As I spoke, Alex's expression darkened. You need to be careful, he said. Whoever those people are, they're not just messing around. They know about you, and they want you to feel threatened. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to return to the woods, this time with Alex. We waited until late afternoon, when the fading light still offered some visibility, but added an edge of tension to our surroundings. We brought flashlights, a small utility knife, and Alex's dog, a large German shepherd named Max. The trail to the clearing felt even more ominous the second time. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at the sky. When we reached the clearing, everything was as I'd left it. The makeshift shelter stood in the center, its tarp flapping lightly in the breeze. Alex examined the shelter while I picked up the notebook again. This is definitely recent, Alex said, motioning to the food wrappers. Whoever's staying here hasn't been gone long. I flipped through the notebook, my heart racing as I came across more disturbing entries. Most were disjointed phrases and sketches, but one page caught my attention. What does that mean? Alex asked, peering over my shoulder. I don't know, I said, my voice trembling, but it feels like a threat. Before we could analyze further, Max let out a low growl, his ears pricking up. What is it, boy? Alex whispered, gripping the leash tightly. Max's growl deepened, and he began pulling toward the edge of the clearing. I shone my flashlight in the direction he was looking, and my blood turned to ice. Two figures stood just beyond the trees, their faces obscured by masks. Time to go, Alex said, his voice firm but tense. We backed away slowly, keeping our flashlights trained on the figures. They didn't move, but their presence was enough to send a clear message. As soon as we were out of the clearing, we broke into a run, Max leading the way back to the house. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were escalating. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to stop. And now, they knew I was onto them. As I sat in the living room, the security feed open on my laptop, I couldn't help but wonder what their next move would be, and whether I'd be ready for it. The next morning, a thick fog hung over the neighborhood, wrapping everything in a cold, gray blanket. I stood at my window, sipping coffee, my mind replaying the events of the previous night. The masked figures, the notebook, and Alex's ominous warning all felt like puzzle pieces I couldn't quite fit together. I needed a plan. It was clear that the people in the woods weren't just messing around. They were deliberate, methodical, and I was in their sights. I called Alex. They're not going to stop, I said, my voice laced with frustration. We need to figure out who they are and what they want. I agree, Alex said, though his tone was cautious. But we need to be smart about this. If we push too hard, we could make things worse. Worse? I repeated, incredulous. They're already trespassing on my property and leaving cryptic messages. How much worse can it get? Alex sighed. Let's meet up later. I'll bring some gear, and we can try to figure out what they're up to. By evening, Alex arrived at my house with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were flashlights, a pair of walkie-talkies, and a compact drone equipped with a camera. This should help us get a better look at the area without walking straight into a trap, he explained. We decided to wait until nightfall, reasoning that whoever was behind the disturbances would likely be more active under cover of darkness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we set up our gear in the living room. The drone hummed softly as Alex calibrated it, and I double-checked the security cameras to ensure everything was recording. Around 10 p.m., we launched the drone from my backyard. Its tiny, blinking light disappeared into the night sky as Alex piloted it toward the woods. The video feed displayed on my laptop showed the treetops swaying in the breeze, their branches casting jagged shadows on the forest floor. There, I said, pointing to the screen. The drone's camera had picked up a faint glow deeper in the woods, likely a fire. Alex maneuvered the drone closer, and the glow sharpened into the flickering flames of a campfire. Around it sat 3 figures, their faces still obscured by masks. They appeared to be talking, though we couldn't make out the words. One of them gestured toward a nearby tree, and the others nodded. "What are they doing?" I whispered. Alex zoomed in, and we saw what had caught their attention. A small wooden box sat at the base of the tree, partially hidden by leaves. "What's in the box?" Alex muttered, more to himself than to me. The figures stood and began moving around the campfire, each taking up a different position as if guarding the area. "I don't like this," I said. "Neither do I," Alex admitted. "But we're not going to learn anything just watching." We decided to head into the woods. The walkie-talkies crackled softly as we tested them, their faint static adding to the tension. Armed with flashlights and a renewed determination, we retraced our steps to the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife absent. As we approached the clearing, we switched off our flashlights and moved carefully, relying on the moonlight to guide us. The campfire was still burning, but the figures were nowhere to be seen. "Where did they go?" I whispered. Alex scanned the area with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. "I don't know. Stay close." We crept closer to the fire, our eyes darting around for any sign of movement. The wooden box was still at the base of the tree, exactly where we'd seen it on the drone's feed. "I'll check it out," Alex said, stepping forward cautiously. I stayed back, my heart pounding as I watched him kneel beside the box. He opened it slowly, his movements deliberate. "What's inside?" I asked, barely able to contain my anxiety. Alex's face darkened. "You're not going to like this." He held up a bundle of papers, each one covered in strange symbols and drawings. They looked similar to the sketches in the notebook I'd found. "There's more," he said, pulling out a small, rusted key and a photograph. The photo sent a chill down my spine. It was a picture of my house, taken from a distance. Before we could process what we'd found, a loud snap echoed through the woods. "Run!" Alex hissed, shoving the items back into the box and grabbing my arm. We bolted toward the tree line, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we navigated the uneven terrain. Behind us, footsteps thundered, growing louder with each passing second. I glanced over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of one of the masked figures chasing us, their dark silhouette a menacing blur in the moonlight. "Faster!" Alex urged, his voice tight with fear. We broke through the trees and into my backyard, slamming the gate shut behind us. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking as adrenaline coursed through my veins. "Inside," Alex said, pulling me toward the house. We locked the doors and windows, then collapsed in the living room, gasping for breath. The rest of the night was a blur. We reviewed the drone footage and examined the contents of the box, but no new answers emerged. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex leaned back, his expression grim. "We need help. This is bigger than us." The next day, we contacted the police again, this time providing them with the drone footage and the items from the box. The officer we spoke to seemed skeptical, but agreed to send a team to investigate the woods. In the meantime, Alex and I decided to stay vigilant. We set up additional cameras around the house and made a pact to check in with each other every few hours. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The people in the woods had escalated their actions, and it was only a matter of time before they struck again. As night fell once more, I sat in the living room, the security feed open on my laptop. The house was silent, but the tension in the air was palpable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then, just past midnight, the motion sensor on the back camera lit up. 3 figures stood at the edge of the yard, their masks gleaming in the moonlight. This time, they didn't just stand there. They started walking toward the house. The figures advanced slowly, their movements deliberate, as if savoring the fear they knew they were causing. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them on the screen, their masked faces illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. "Alex!" I yelled, grabbing the walkie-talkie. "I see them," came his tense reply. "Stay inside. I'm on my way." The three figures split up, one heading toward the back door, another circling to the side, and the third lingering near the gate. My security cameras tracked their movements, but the knowledge that they were so close made me feel helpless. I locked every door and window, my fingers trembling as I double-checked the deadbolts. Grabbing the crowbar Alex had left earlier, I positioned myself near the stairs, ready to defend my home if it came to that. Minutes felt like hours. My breath caught in my throat when I heard a loud bang at the back door. "Come out!" a voice growled, muffled but menacing. I gripped the crowbar tighter, my knuckles white. The banging continued, each thud reverberating through the house. Then came the sound of glass shattering. My stomach dropped. They were inside. I retreated upstairs, heart racing, and locked myself in the bedroom. My phone buzzed with a message from Alex. 5 minutes away. Stay hidden." Peering out the window, I saw his car speeding down the street, headlights cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived as footsteps echoed from downstairs. The intruders moved through the house, their voices low but urgent. "Search everything," one of them said. I strained to hear more, catching snippets of their conversation. "The box. He's got it. Check the laptop." They were looking for the drone footage, the photographs, the evidence that tied them to their crimes. A creak on the stairs made my blood run cold. They were coming up. I positioned myself behind the door, crowbar raised, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The doorknob rattled, and the door swung open slowly. A masked figure stepped inside, scanning the room. I didn't hesitate. With all my strength, I swung the crowbar, hitting him square in the side. He stumbled back with a grunt, dropping the knife he'd been holding. I bolted past him down the stairs just as Alex burst through the front door. "Get down!" Alex shouted, holding a baseball bat. The second intruder lunged at him, but Alex swung the bat, knocking the man to the ground. The third masked figure, realizing they were outmatched, bolted for the door. "Stop!" Alex yelled, but the figure disappeared into the night. The first two intruders lay on the floor, groaning in pain, their masks now askew. Alex and I secured them with zip ties, his hands shaking but steady. The police arrived minutes later, their flashing lights bathing the house in red and blue. Officers stormed in, taking the two masked intruders into custody. "You did the right thing calling us," one of the officers said as they loaded the suspects into their cars. "Did you catch the third one?" I asked, my voice still trembling. "We've got units searching the area," the officer replied. "We'll find them." As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a wave. Alex and I sat on the front steps, watching as the police processed the scene. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though the events of the night would likely haunt me for a long time. "They won't be back," he said, trying to reassure me. "I hope you're right," I replied. The police investigation revealed that the group had been behind several break-ins and burglaries in the area. They used the woods as their base of operations, targeting homes they thought were easy marks. The photographs, the symbols, and the strange rituals were all part of an elaborate scheme to intimidate their victims and throw off suspicion. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. I upgraded my security system, added more cameras, and started attending neighborhood meetings to ensure we all looked out for each other. Alex and I grew closer, our bond strengthened by the ordeal. But some nights, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The third intruder had never been caught, and the woods behind my house remained dark and silent, hiding secrets I might never fully understand. One night, as I stood by my window, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the trees, a flicker of light, like a distant campfire. But when I blinked, it was gone. I closed the curtains, locking the window for good measure. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens in the night. It's knowing that some shadows never truly disappear.
Hi there, my name's Toby, and I used to work as a detective in a small, quiet town called Maplewood. It wasn't a big city or anything, but strange things happened now and then. One case, though, has stayed with me all these years. It's the one I still think about late at night when everything's quiet. It all started with a phone call. The call came from a woman named Clara Wilkes. Clara was a single mom in her 30s who lived in an old, creaky house on the edge of Maplewood. She had 2 twin daughters, Rosie and Lily, who were 8 years old. They were bright, playful kids with freckles and wild red hair. Clara worked 2 jobs to take care of them, mornings at the library and nights as a waitress. That evening, Clara called me in a panic. "Toby," she said, her voice trembling, "Rosie and Lily are gone. I put them to bed at 8 like always, but when I went to check on them at 10, they weren't in their beds. At first, I thought they might have just wandered off. Maplewood was a safe town, the kind where kids rode bikes and played in the woods without anyone worrying too much. Still, something about Clara's voice made my stomach twist. "Did they leave a note?" I asked. "No," Clara said, "but their bedroom window was open, and..." She paused. There were muddy footprints on the floor. I grabbed my coat and flashlight, hopped into my old Chevy, and headed to her house. Clara's house sat at the edge of the woods, its peeling paint and sagging porch giving it a haunted look even on the brightest days. That night, under the dim glow of the porch light, it looked even worse. Clara met me at the door, her hands shaking. She led me upstairs to the girls' room. The twins shared a bunk bed, and their room was filled with stuffed animals, colorful drawings taped to the walls, and books piled everywhere. But the bed was empty. The window was wide open, and the chilly night air made the curtains sway. On the wooden floor, just like Clara said, were muddy footprints, small, like a child's. They led from the window to the bunk bed, and then back again. "Do they have any friends they might have gone to?" I asked. Clara shook her head. "Not at this hour. They're scared of the dark. They wouldn't wander off at night." I noticed something else. A small stuffed rabbit lying near the window. Its button eyes seemed to stare at me. Clara said it belonged to Rosie. I told Clara to stay by the phone in case the twins came back or someone called, and then I went outside to look around. Behind the house was the woods, thick with tall pines and twisted branches. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I followed the footprints leading from the window into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching the leaves. The footprints eventually stopped near a small clearing. That's when I saw something strange. There was a circle of stones on the ground, arranged like some kind of ritual. In the center was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox with strange carvings on it. I opened the box, and inside was a bundle of black feathers and a single old photograph. It showed 2 children, a boy and a girl, standing in front of a house that looked just like Clara's. But this photo was old, maybe from the 1920s. The next morning, I took the photograph to Maplewood's historian, Mr. Edgar Finch. Edgar was in his 70s with thick glasses and a love for old stories. When I showed him the photo, his face went pale. "That's the Winslow house," he said, referring to Clara's home. "And those are the Winslow twins, Isaac and Ida. They went missing nearly 100 years ago." "What happened to them?" I asked. "No one knows," Edgar said. "One night they vanished. Some people say the house is cursed, that the twins were taken by something in the woods." I didn't believe in curses, but the story gave me chills. I went back to Clara's house that afternoon to tell her what I'd found. When I got there, Clara said she'd heard something during the night, a soft tapping on the window. It scared her so much that she didn't sleep. I decided to check the girls' room again. This time, I noticed something I'd missed before. A piece of paper tucked under the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't a normal piece of paper. It was old, yellowed, and crinkled. The paper had a message written in shaky handwriting. "They are here. Find the hollow tree." Clara and I went into the woods together, following the path I'd taken the night before. I had a feeling the hollow tree wasn't far from the stone circle. Sure enough, after some searching, we found it. A massive oak with a hollow trunk. Inside the hollow was a staircase, spiraling down into the ground. Clara clutched my arm, her face pale. "Do you think they're down there?" she whispered. "There's only one way to find out," I said. We climbed down the staircase, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom was a dark tunnel that seemed to go on forever. At the end of the tunnel, we found a door. It was made of wood, with strange carvings like the ones on the box. I pushed it open, and there they were, Rosie and Lily, sitting on the floor, holding hands. They looked unharmed, but their eyes were wide with fear. "Mommy!" they cried when they saw Clara. We grabbed them and ran back up the staircase. As we reached the surface, I heard something behind us. A low growl, like an animal, but deeper. I didn't look back. We made it back to the house and locked the doors. The twins were safe, but they couldn't explain what had happened. They only said they heard a voice calling them into the woods. After that night, Clara decided to move out of Maplewood. I don't blame her. Some things can't be explained, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But sometimes, when I drive past the old Winslow house, I swear I see two small figures standing in the window, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of what had happened in those woods. Clara and the twins were safe for now, but there were too many unanswered questions. What was that box with the feathers and the old photograph? Who or what had left that note? And what had growled at us in the tunnel? The next day I decided to dig deeper. First, I went back to the historian, Edgar Finch, to ask if he knew anything more about the Winslow twins or the woods around Clara's house. Edgar wasn't surprised to see me. "I had a feeling you'd be back," he said, motioning for me to sit. He pulled out a dusty old book and opened it to a chapter titled The Forgotten Forest. "The woods behind the Winslow house have always been strange," Edgar began. "Even before the town was built, the indigenous tribes avoided that area. They said it was home to something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. They called it the Whisperer." "Why the Whisperer?" I asked. "Because it calls to people," Edgar said. "Lures them into the woods with promises or sounds they can't resist. Some say it only targets children because they're easier to trick. Others think it feeds on their fear." I thought about Rosie and Lily, how they said they'd heard a voice calling them. It gave me chills. I showed Edgar the old photograph from the box. "What about this? Do you recognize these carvings or symbols?" Edgar squinted at the photo, then nodded slowly. "These are protection symbols," he said. "The Winslows must have been trying to protect themselves, or their children, from whatever was in those woods. But it looks like it didn't work." I asked him if he'd ever heard of the hollow tree or the underground tunnel. "There are stories," Edgar admitted. "Some say the Whisperer has a lair underground, hidden in the roots of the oldest trees, but no one's ever come back to confirm it." That night I got a call from Clara. She and the twins were staying with her sister in town, but something strange had happened. "Toby," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Rosie woke up screaming. She said she saw something outside her window, a shadow with glowing eyes." I drove over to Clara's sister's house right away. Rosie was curled up in Clara's lap, trembling. Lily sat next to them, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Rosie," I said gently, kneeling down to her level, "can you tell me what you saw?" She nodded slowly. "It was tall," she whispered, "and its eyes were really bright, like fireflies. It was standing in the yard, just looking at me." "Did it say anything?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, but I heard it in my head. It said, "Come back." Clara was terrified. What does it want? Why won't it leave us alone? I didn't have an answer, but I knew we had to act fast. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. I decided to go back to the woods, this time prepared. I brought a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook to document everything. Edgar insisted on coming with me, saying he had a few tricks up his sleeve. He packed some salt, sage, and a small, old leather-bound book full of prayers and incantations. "You really believe in this stuff?" I asked as we drove to the Winslow house. "I believe in being prepared," Edgar replied. We reached the hollow tree just as the sun was setting. The woods were even more unsettling at night, the shadows between the trees seeming to shift and move. Edgar sprinkled salt around the base of the tree, muttering something under his breath. "This should keep anything from coming out while we're inside," he said. We descended the staircase again, this time ready for whatever was down there. The air was colder than before, and the tunnel seemed darker even with our flashlights. When we reached the door, it was already open. Inside, the room looked different. There were markings on the walls now, glowing faintly in the dark. They were the same symbols from the photograph, but they seemed to pulse, like they were alive. Suddenly, the air grew heavy and a low rumbling sound filled the room. Edgar and I spun around, and that's when we saw it. It was tall, like Rosie had described, its body cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its long, claw-like fingers scraped against the walls as it moved. Edgar stepped forward, holding out the leather book. He began chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The creature stopped, tilting its head as if it were listening. Then it let out a deafening screech, the sound so sharp it felt like my ears would burst. "Keep going," I shouted to Edgar, who was visibly shaking but didn't stop. The creature lunged toward us, but it stopped at the edge of the salt circle Edgar had made earlier. It hissed and clawed at the invisible barrier, its glowing eyes fixed on me. "You can't have them," I shouted, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe I'd figured out that this thing wanted Rosie and Lily more than anything. Edgar finished his chant, and the glowing symbols on the walls flared brightly. The creature let out one last bone-chilling scream before dissolving into a cloud of black smoke. The room fell silent. When we got back to the surface, the air felt lighter, and the woods were no longer silent. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the leaves. "Do you think it's gone?" I asked Edgar. "For now," he said grimly. "But things like that don't stay gone forever. The girls will need to be protected." I made sure Clara and the twins moved far away from Maplewood, to a place where the woods wouldn't call to them. As for me, I still think about that night. Sometimes when the wind howls or the trees creak, I wonder if the Whisperer is still out there, waiting for its next chance. Sure. Here's a spooky story based on the provided context, adapted into a simpler, scarier tale for kids in first person. The names and details have been adjusted to create a fresh story that builds tension gradually. I never thought a camping trip could change everything, but one strange weekend did. I was in my mid-20s at the time, hanging out with my old group of friends. We'd known each other since high school, and although we weren't all super close, we always found time to hang out. There were 6 of us. Me, my cousin Ben, 2 of my best friends, Gracie and Olivia, and 2 other guys, Mason and Carter. We had been through a lot together, from study sessions to late-night pizza runs. The good old days. Then, one day, Mason brought in someone new, a guy named Travis. He'd met him at work, and Mason said he was a great guy who had the best stories. We didn't think much of it at first. We were a tight-knit group, and nobody ever really joined in. But Travis was different. He had this way about him. He didn't have to try, but everyone gravitated toward him. He was always laughing, always helping out, and soon enough, he was coming along to everything. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. Travis was great at making us feel special. He always knew what to say, whether it was making us feel like the most important person in the world, or telling amazing stories of his wild past. He told us about sneaking out of his house as a kid, running away from trouble, and getting into the craziest situations. It was hard not to like him. He made us feel alive. But deep down, there was a part of me that wondered if something was missing, or if he was too good to be true. After a few months of hanging out, things started to change. One night, Gracie texted us that she was having a problem at work with a rude coworker, and Travis immediately jumped into action. He said he knew some people and promised to help her out. Within 2 weeks, Gracie had a new job with better pay and more benefits. It was impressive. Everyone was so grateful, and Travis was the hero of our group. He became the person we turned to whenever anything went wrong. But it wasn't long before things started to feel strange. Travis had become the leader, even though he was the newest member of our group. He picked where we ate, where we hung out, and we all went along with it because, well, he was the one who helped us out so much. No one wanted to question him. One night, though, when we were all together, something happened that I couldn't shake. Olivia mentioned how she was craving the usual buffalo wings we always got from our favorite spot, but Travis suddenly said he wanted to support a local restaurant instead. I was confused. I didn't mind trying new things, but it was our tradition to get wings. Gracie didn't like the idea either, but we went along with it, trying to please Travis. The food was okay, but not what I wanted, and Gracie wasn't happy either. It felt like Travis had manipulated us into doing what he wanted, even if it was something small like food. But we let it go. Weeks went by, and Travis's hold on us only grew stronger. He took the lead in every situation, making decisions for the group. At first it seemed harmless. He would suggest fun outings, like a quirky Brazilian barbecue with karaoke, or a weekend trip to a fancy glamping site he loved. Everyone was on board for the glamping trip except for me. I didn't like the idea of being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by bugs and mud. Gracie was with me, but the others, including Ben and Mason, were excited. They said we owed it to Travis since he'd helped all of us out so much. I didn't want to argue, so I went along. Everyone was on board for the glamping trip except for me. I didn't like the idea of being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by bugs and mud. Gracie was with me, but the others, including Ben and Mason, were excited. They said we owed it to Travis since he'd helped all of us out so much. I didn't want to argue, so I went along. The trip was a disaster from the start. After hours of driving, we finally reached the site, and it wasn't anything like I imagined. There were tents, but they looked flimsy. The beds were uncomfortable, and the only thing decent was a building with actual toilets and showers. Gracie, Olivia, and I complained a little, but Travis kept assuring us that it was better than rough camping. He smiled that wide, charming smile of his, and we reluctantly accepted. That night, Travis gathered us around the campfire and told us he always started his trips with a prayer to the heavens. We all thought he was joking, but when we started to laugh, he gave us a serious look. "This is how it's done," he said, and we reluctantly followed his lead. The next morning, Travis had something even stranger planned. He wanted us all to go on a hike to a waterfall. It sounded like fun, but after a long trek through the woods, we reached the water, and Travis told us to jump in. But the water was freezing, and I didn't want to do it. Gracie and Olivia agreed with me, but Mason, Ben, and Carter were already on board. Travis kept pushing, saying that we all needed to do it, to bond as friends. It got worse when he insisted that everyone strip down to jump in. We weren't that close with each other, not like that, and I was really uncomfortable. But Travis didn't take no for an answer. He started getting angry, telling us that we had to trust him, that we owed him for everything he'd done. I told him no, but it wasn't just him anymore. The other guys started to gang up on us, trying to force us to do it. In that moment, something snapped. The group I once knew, my friends, weren't the same anymore. Travis had changed them. I fought off Ben, and Gracie, Olivia, and I backed away. We knew something was very wrong. It wasn't just about getting naked. It was about how far Travis was willing to go to get us to do what he wanted. And the guys, they weren't the friends I thought they were. Gracie, Olivia, and I ran back toward camp, and Travis followed us, yelling at us to come back. But we didn't listen. We packed our things and left immediately. The drive home was long and silent. Olivia and Gracie were crying in the back seat, and I was just trying to keep it together. When we finally got home, I felt empty. That was the last time we'd ever see Travis. The next day, we all met up at Gracie's house and talked about what happened. We all agreed that Travis wasn't the person we thought he was. We couldn't trust him anymore, and neither could we trust the others who sided with him. I'm not sure how to explain what happened that day, but I know one thing for sure. Travis had a way of making you feel special, but he used that power to control us. We had to break away, and we did. As for Travis, I don't know where he is now, but I hear he's on social media, giving speeches and calling himself a motivational speaker. He's gotten a lot of attention, but I can't look at him the same way anymore. And to this day, I never went on another camping trip with anyone. I guess sometimes people you trust can turn into something you never saw coming. I learned the hard way that not everyone who seems nice has your best interests at heart. So remember, if something feels wrong, it probably is. This version follows the core structure of your reference but reimagines the characters, making it more suitable for a spooky, tense bedtime story. Sure, here is the continuation of the story with more details added. So, there we were. 6 friends who had been through it all. High school, college, first jobs, heartaches, and everything in between. We had a bond that felt unbreakable. Something that had lasted since we were all teenagers. Our friend group, which was a mix of 3 women and 3 men, always felt like home. We met during our freshman year of high school, and since we all lived in the same small town, we stayed close as we transitioned into college. Sure, some people drifted away, but we stayed strong. We joked that we'd be the kind of group that would always have each other's backs. I remember the first time we all met Richard's new friend, a guy named Marcus. Marcus was different from any of the people we'd brought into our group before. He was the kind of guy who didn't need to make an effort to be charming. There was something magnetic about him. He wasn't loud or in your face. It was his calm confidence that drew you in. He could talk for hours, and the way he spoke made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. He had a way of making you feel seen, and we all liked him right away. Marcus came into our circle easily, and at first everything seemed normal. He joined us for our regular hangouts, whether we were grabbing burgers at the local diner or watching movies at someone's house. He always had these wild stories to share. Stories about his childhood, about getting in trouble with his parents, sneaking out to meet a girl they hated, running away from home, getting caught by the police, and a million other crazy things. He told these stories like they were just everyday events, and we couldn't get enough. He made it sound like he'd lived a life full of adventure, and we all found ourselves listening with rapt attention, hanging on every word. As time passed, Marcus became a bigger and bigger part of our group. He had this uncanny ability to help people when they were in a jam. One of our friends, Naomi, was fired from her job after standing up to a co-worker who had crossed a line. We all rallied behind her, but Marcus took things a step further. He didn't just listen to us vent or offer words of comfort. He had connections. He knew people who could help, and within a few days, Naomi had a new job offer, better pay, and more benefits. We were all amazed. Marcus didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He wasn't like anyone we'd ever met. One time, when my childhood friend Gavin needed help moving into a new place, Marcus brought over his friends and made sure no one had to pay for movers. He insisted on helping, and he wasn't just about the big gestures. It wasn't uncommon for him to show up with a coffee for whoever needed one, or to simply listen when someone was going through something. He made us all feel like we mattered, and that kind of kindness was rare. But something about Marcus started to feel off to me. It wasn't anything specific at first. It was more of a feeling I couldn't shake. He started making decisions for us, like where we should hang out or what we should do, and at first we didn't mind. It felt nice to have someone take charge, someone who seemed to always know what was best. But then, I noticed the small things. Little things that didn't sit right with me. For example, one evening when we were talking about going to our usual pizza place, Marcus suggested a new spot in town. We all agreed. though I really wasn't keen on it. The new place was small and cramped. The food wasn't as good as our usual hangout, and I couldn't help but feel like it was all part of a bigger plan, like he wanted to change us, change the way we did things. At that moment, I started to realize that Marcus wasn't just helping us out, he was subtly controlling us. It wasn't just me who felt it. My best friend Laura and I had started to talk about it in private. We began noticing how Marcus would steer conversations in his direction, how he'd make people feel guilty for disagreeing with him. For example, when our friend Sophie mentioned wanting to visit her family for the weekend, Marcus made sure she felt bad about it. He told her that it was important to spend time with the people who mattered, which sounded nice, but when she pushed back, he gave her this look. A quiet, unsettling look that made her hesitate. It was like he knew how to manipulate people without them realizing it. The turning point came when Marcus planned a weekend getaway. He called it his special trip, and insisted that we all go, even though most of us were reluctant. Laura and I were both hesitant, but Marcus had this way of making everyone feel like they owed him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low but firm. "This trip is important to me. I've put so much into it, and I want to share it with all of you." Eventually, we all agreed. And that's when things really started to get weird. We drove for hours to this secluded spot, miles away from civilization. When we arrived, I was expecting something a little more glamorous. After all, he'd been hyping it up as a luxurious escape. Instead, we were faced with tents that barely seemed sturdy enough for a storm, a damp campsite, and a campfire that didn't seem to warm anyone up. At first, we tried to make the best of it, but something felt off. Marcus gathered us all around the campfire, and without warning, he started talking about spiritual energy and how this trip would help us all connect on a deeper level. I thought it was weird, but I went along with it. The rest of the group did too, even though Laura and I exchanged uneasy glances. As the night went on, things started to spiral. Marcus led us in some bizarre ritual where he wanted us all to strip down and jump into a freezing lake as some sort of cleansing exercise. At first, I thought he was joking, but when he became serious, I could feel the tension building. I didn't want to participate, and neither did Laura. The other guys were all for it, egging us on, calling us scared. Marcus wasn't asking, he was demanding. He started pulling at people's clothes, and before I knew it, we were all being pushed to the edge of this freezing lake. I could see it in the eyes of the others. They were just as uncomfortable as I was, but they were too scared to say no. It felt like a mob mentality was taking over, and I couldn't breathe. The worst part was seeing the way Marcus stood there like he was orchestrating this whole thing, his face showing no emotion, just cold determination. That's when I snapped. I grabbed Laura's arm and pulled her away, shouting at the guys to stop. But they didn't. Marcus didn't move. He just stood there, watching us, waiting for us to give in. It felt like everything I'd known about him was a lie. This wasn't the man who had helped us through tough times. This was someone dangerous. We ran back to the campsite, gathered our things, and I told everyone we were leaving. It was time to go home. As we drove away from that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just happened. I never saw Marcus again after that trip. The rest of us cut ties with him, but we didn't just cut ties with him. We cut ties with each other too. The whole group fell apart. We all went our separate ways, some of us to therapy to figure out what went wrong, others just trying to move on with our lives. But no matter how far I moved from that trip, I could never forget the way Marcus made me feel, the way he took everything we had and twisted it for his own benefit. It was like he had been playing a game with us the whole time, and we had been too blind to see it. It's been years, and every time I hear someone talk about Marcus, I shudder. I still don't know what really happened that day, what changed in him, but I know one thing for sure. Sometimes the nicest people are the most dangerous. Hope this expansion builds on the story and adds to the tension and suspense. It was the summer of 1990, and I had just turned 15. My name is Alex, and I lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere. Well, somewhere in rural Virginia. It wasn't much, just a place where everyone knew everyone's business, and the most exciting thing was the county fair once a year. My father had spent most of his life in the army, but when he retired, he decided to settle here. It was supposed to be a peaceful life after all the chaos of military life, but the stillness began to eat at him. For a few years, my dad kept himself busy with projects around the house and working on his old truck, but after a while, the boredom got to him. Even though my mom was a bookkeeper and made a good living, he didn't like sitting around, so he started taking up jobs at the local gas stations. It wasn't because we needed the money, it was because he needed something to do, something to keep his mind sharp. I didn't mind it, though. Sometimes he would let me come along and help out. It wasn't much, just stocking the coolers or filling the shelves. In a small town like ours, the owners didn't mind much, as long as I didn't sell any alcohol or cigarettes. It was a quiet life, one I had grown used to. One evening in early fall, I was sitting at a table by the big windows of the gas station convenience store. I had my feet up on the seat, a half-empty Mountain Dew beside me, and a book in my hands. I liked coming here after school. It was a place I could be alone, do my homework, or just kill time. That evening, though, something caught my eye. I looked up from my book and saw a figure walking across the parking lot. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by, but it was strange that she was coming from the direction of the highway. The interstate ran through our town, but we rarely got people walking from that way, especially not this time of night. I thought she might have broken down or something. She was walking slowly, almost as if she didn't have anywhere else to go. And as she got closer, I saw she was wearing an old jacket that didn't look like it belonged in the humid summer heat. When she stepped inside, the bell above the door jingled, and she looked around for a moment before her eyes landed on my dad behind the counter. "Hi, I need help," she said, her voice soft and kind of shaky. I remember feeling a bit of unease when she spoke, but I didn't know why. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My dad, though, just nodded without saying much. He was usually pretty friendly with customers, but he seemed distant with her. "I'm stranded," the woman continued. "I need a ride up to Springfield. My car broke down a few miles back on the highway. Could you help me out?" I watched as my dad didn't respond right away. It was as if he was weighing his options, or maybe he just didn't like the way she looked. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I'm working right now, ma'am. I can't really leave. I'm sorry." Her expression changed immediately, like she wasn't used to being rejected. She stood there for a second, eyes flicking between me and my dad. She seemed to hesitate before turning her gaze toward me. "Can he drive me?" she asked, pointing at me. I was confused at first, but when I saw my dad's eyes shift to me, he shook his head. I could see the warning in his expression, but the woman didn't notice. I just got my learner's permit," I said awkwardly, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'm not supposed to be driving anyone." The woman's face twisted into something I couldn't quite understand. Then she muttered a curse under her breath. "Great. So now I'm stranded because of some rules?" She didn't stop there. She started to raise her voice, her words sharp and angry. "Just get out of my way, then," she snapped at my dad. My father's face hardened, and without saying another word, he waved toward the door. "Leave," he said simply. The woman's anger flared for a second, and then, as if she couldn't control herself anymore, she yanked open the door so hard that the glass rattled. She stormed out of the store, muttering under her breath. I stood there, unsure of what just happened, but as I watched her walk toward the highway again, a strange feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. It wasn't until nearly a year later, just a few days before my 16th birthday, that I would realize just how strange that encounter really was. I was sitting in my bedroom, trying to cram for a math test, when I heard my dad's voice echoing from the living room. "Alex, get in here now!" I jumped up, my heart racing. It wasn't often that my dad sounded that urgent. I rushed into the living room, where my dad was pointing at the TV. "There," he said.
That's the woman. I looked at the screen and sure enough, there she was. The same woman who had been at the gas station just a year before. But now, she wasn't just a stranger in need of a ride. She was the subject of a news report. The woman had been arrested, and the reporter was talking about her involvement in a string of unsolved murders across the state. They showed her mugshot, and the details were chilling. The woman, whose name was Sharon Wells, had been convicted of several murders over the years, and she had been sentenced to death. I couldn't believe it. I had almost given her a ride. She had asked me, looked me in the eyes, and for a moment, I had considered it. I had no idea how close I had come to something terrible. But what disturbed me even more was the way my dad had reacted. He wasn't just trying to protect me from breaking the law. He had known something was off. He must have seen something in her eyes when she walked in that day. Something dangerous. I started paying more attention to things after that, trying to trust my instincts more. It wasn't just that woman I had to worry about. There were other times when my gut had told me something wasn't right, but I didn't listen. One day, a few months after I turned 16, my mom had to stop by a store to pick up some supplies for her bookkeeping work. I had gone with her that day, but I wasn't expecting much excitement. The store was in a rundown area of town, and I had learned to stay alert, especially around the homeless people who often hung around there. As we walked into the store, I saw Randy, the homeless man who often sat outside. He was a regular and never caused trouble, so the store owners let him rest there on rainy days. That day it was storming outside, and he was sitting by the door, his face hidden under the brim of his old hat. Mom asked me to wait by the counter while she took care of business. I started playing with an old broken cash register, pressing the buttons and pretending to run the store. It was quiet, too quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I felt someone tug on my shirt. I spun around, expecting to see my mom, but instead, I found myself face to face with an older couple. They didn't look like anyone I knew. The man had deep wrinkles, and the woman had a cold smile that made my skin crawl. "Hey, kid," the man said. "You want a puppy? We've got some in the car. Come on, we'll show you." My heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. I remembered my mom's warnings about strangers, especially people offering things like that. I tried to back away, but the man grabbed my arm, his grip strong despite his age. "Come on," he growled, pulling me toward the door. I froze, panic setting in. But then, just as I was about to scream, Randy appeared out of nowhere, standing between us. "Everything okay here, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. The couple stopped, looking at each other, then quickly muttered something about looking for their son. They rushed past Randy and out the door without another word. My heart was racing. I knew they weren't looking for a lost child. They were trying to take me. I quickly ran to my mom, who had heard the commotion and came over just in time to stop the couple. After they left, Randy gave me a knowing look. He had seen it too. That was the moment I realized how dangerous the world could be, and how much I needed to trust my instincts. Months passed, and I still couldn't shake the memory of that day. The woman at the gas station, the strange couple, and the close calls I had experienced. It all started to feel like one big warning. I didn't know who to trust anymore. My dad, who had seen through Sharon Wells from the start, kept his eyes open for anything out of the ordinary. He never let me forget that feeling of unease we both had when we met her. Eventually, I came to realize that the world isn't always as safe as it seems, and that trust, true trust, isn't something to give lightly. The woman's arrest made the news everywhere, and as I watched the reports, I couldn't help but feel lucky. My dad had been right. He had known exactly what to do. Years later, I still think about that night. I've driven by that gas station a few times, but it never feels the same. The memories are all there, lurking in the back of my mind, a reminder of how close I came to something terrible. I've learned a lot since then, about trusting my instincts, about the world being a lot darker than we like to believe. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget what happened, because sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who can hurt you the most.
It's been years now since that day with Sharon Wells, the strange couple, and everything else that followed. I'm in my late 20s now, far removed from that small town and those quiet nights. I moved away after high school, seeking a new life far from the people and memories that still haunted me. But the truth is, no matter how far I've gone, those moments are always with me. I've seen things, heard stories, and met people from all walks of life. Some good, some bad, but all of them have shaped me in ways I never expected. But every now and then, I'll think back to that gas station, to my dad's warning eyes and Randy's quiet protection. And I can't help but feel that those lessons, those strange, unnerving encounters, were meant to shape who I became. A few months ago, I returned to my old town for a family reunion. The gas station is still there, but it's changed. The new owners put in a fresh coat of paint, made it look modern, but the windows are the same place I used to sit and stare out into the quiet, empty parking lot. I decided to stop by. It felt like a weird pull, like something was calling me back. When I walked in, it wasn't like I remembered. The air was different, and the shelves were stacked with new, unfamiliar products. But there was one thing that hadn't changed: the feeling. That same odd sense that had crept up on me years ago. The counter where my dad had stood all those years ago was still there. And for a moment I could almost hear the sound of his voice, the way he'd talk to regular customers or how he'd joke with me when I helped him out. I missed him a lot. I glanced at the old register where I'd played with the buttons, and the memories of that day, the day the strange woman walked in and changed everything, came flooding back. It felt like time had slowed for just a moment, and I could see my younger self, unaware, naive, trusting people too easily. I had to admit, I didn't listen to my gut back then, not until it was too late. But life has a funny way of teaching you things. I'd been through a lot since then, learned to be cautious, to always trust my instincts, no matter how small the warning signs seemed. Every person I met, every odd encounter, shaped me into someone different, someone wiser. As I stood there, the clerk behind the counter asked if I needed help, and I just nodded, lost in thought. I decided it was time to leave, to get back to my life. But as I walked out the door, something caught my eye. There, standing by the old gas pumps, was a man who looked like he had just come out of nowhere. He wore a leather jacket, his face hidden beneath a cap, and he stood there, as if waiting for something. For a moment, my heart skipped a beat. My mind immediately flashed to the woman from so many years ago, to the unease that had filled my chest when I first saw her. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling didn't leave. My instincts were on high alert. I turned away quickly, not wanting to take chances. As I drove away, the image of the man stayed with me, the nagging feeling that something was wrong hanging in the air like a storm cloud. But I knew something now that I didn't back then. When you sense danger, you don't wait to find out if you're right. You trust your gut, even if it means walking away. As I pulled out of the parking lot and drove down the quiet, familiar streets of my old town, I finally realized just how much those experiences shaped who I am today. They taught me to be aware, to listen to the silence, to notice the things that aren't said aloud. They taught me to trust myself more than anyone else. In a way, Sharon Wells, the couple at the store, even Randy, they all played a part in shaping me. And I don't think I'll ever forget what they taught me, even though I wish I could. Because in the end, the real lesson wasn't just about survival. It was about the power of paying attention to the world around you and never underestimating your own instincts. That's the only thing that can protect you when everything else is uncertain. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget what happened. Because sometimes, the most dangerous moments aren't the ones we see coming, they're the ones we almost miss. It was a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and not much ever seemed to happen. When I think back to those days, I can still hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the smell of fresh coffee, and the distant sound of cars whizzing by on the highway. My dad used to say that small towns like ours were boring, but in his case, boredom had led him to work at the local gas station. My father, a former army man, had served for 21 years before retiring. He'd always been proud of his service, though I don't think he ever truly understood how much it had changed him. He never really adjusted to civilian life after he got out. At first, it didn't seem to matter. We moved to a small town in Florida, where my mom worked as a bookkeeper. The rent was cheap, the people were friendly enough, and everything felt easy. But then, after a few years, the weight of boredom started to settle in. My dad was a man of routine, always busy with something. But after he left the military, he struggled to fill his days. Retiring from the army had given him some peace, but it also left him restless. My mom made enough money for us to live comfortably, but that wasn't enough for him. So, in his usual stubborn way, he decided to go back to work. He took a job at a gas station just off the highway, working late nights and weekends. He figured it would give him something to do, and it kept him busy, which was all he really wanted. It wasn't much. The owners were nice enough and didn't mind me hanging around. I'd go there after school, helping my dad with stocking the coolers or running the register, as long as I didn't sell any beer or cigarettes. It was a strange kind of job, but it felt normal to me. I didn't mind it. My life at that time was pretty simple. School, work, home. At 15, I'd just gotten my learner's permit, and my dad had started letting me drive him to and from work. He'd let me get some driving experience, both during the day and at night. One night in 1990, right after my birthday, everything changed. It was a typical evening. I was sitting in the corner of the gas station, where we had a small table set up by the windows. I had a book in hand, a Mountain Dew sitting next to me, and some snacks spread out. My dad was behind the counter, greeting the few customers who came in. It was quiet, but that was normal for the small town. It was about 9:30 p.m., and the parking lot was mostly empty. The occasional car would pull up to the pumps, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, something caught my eye. It wasn't much at first, just a figure walking up the driveway from the direction of the interstate. It wasn't strange for someone to walk into the station, but it was strange for someone to be walking from the highway. The station was right off I-75, and the area around it was mostly flat, empty land. You didn't get many pedestrians. I figured she'd probably broken down somewhere and needed to use the phone, but the more I watched, the stranger it seemed. The woman walked steadily, her face hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. She was dressed in a long coat, the kind you might wear during cooler weather, even though the night was warm. It didn't make sense. Nobody ever walked from the highway. The closer she got, the more uneasy I felt, but I couldn't explain why. Something about her just felt off. She came through the door with the same steady pace, her boots tapping lightly against the floor. I watched her for a few moments as she took in the interior of the store, glancing at the shelves, the old cooler at the back, and then moving to the counter. My dad was busy talking to a customer, but he noticed her immediately. I could tell he was uncomfortable. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her as she approached the counter. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. "I've broken down a little north of here. I need to get to Ocala, but I'm stranded." She glanced at my dad, then at me, her eyes lingering for just a moment too long. "Could you give me a ride?" My dad's expression shifted immediately, like a switch had been flipped. He wasn't the type to turn people away, especially not women in need. But this time, he was different. He didn't smile at her or offer the usual pleasantries. He just looked at her and shook his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm working. I can't help you out." I watched the woman's face carefully. Her smile faltered for a brief moment, but she didn't back down. Instead, she turned and looked directly at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. She tilted her head like she was studying me, then she spoke again. "What about him?" she asked, nodding toward me. I blinked, confused. "What?" I said, looking from her to my dad. "I'm not really able to. He can give me a ride,
she said, cutting me off, her voice suddenly insistent. "He has a learner's permit, doesn't he? It's just a short drive. He'll be fine." My dad's face darkened, and I could see the tension in his body. He didn't say anything at first, but I could feel the heat of his gaze. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, but instead, he subtly shook his head. I was confused. I thought he might be overreacting, but there was something about his demeanor that told me this was different. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said again, his voice colder this time. "He can't take you, it's not safe." The woman's face twisted into a frown. "You don't want to help me?" She spat, her voice rising. "What kind of people are you?" I could feel the tension in the air thickening. I glanced at my dad, but his face was unreadable. He just nodded toward the door. "I think it's time for you to leave." The woman's lips curled into a snarl. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. It was hard to see exactly what it was, but she gripped it tightly. "You'll regret this," she muttered under her breath. "You don't know who I am." I wanted to step in, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I could only watch as she turned sharply and stalked out the door, slamming it behind her with a force that made the glass rattle. My dad sighed, rubbing his forehead. He didn't look at me, just kept his eyes focused on the door. I didn't know what to think. I watched her walk down the driveway and out to the highway, her figure fading into the darkness. She made her way to the northbound on-ramp, and I didn't take my eyes off her until she disappeared into the night. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My dad never spoke about what had happened, and I didn't press him. He didn't need to say anything for me to know he was upset. I could see it in his eyes. That night, I went to bed with a strange sense of unease, but I didn't understand why. It wasn't until months later that I found out just how close I had come to being part of a far darker story than I ever could have imagined. The next part of the story would change everything. It wasn't just a strange encounter. It was a warning I had failed to see. But that's a story for later. For now, I just couldn't get her face out of my mind, or the way she looked at me as though she had known something I didn't. The night after the strange woman had left the gas station, the air felt heavier than usual. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, the way she'd turned on my dad, or the way she seemed so sure that I could help her, even though I was just a kid. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. For the next few weeks, life seemed to return to normal. I went to school, helped my dad at the gas station, and spent my free time doing what most 15-year-olds do, hanging out with friends, reading books, and generally trying to avoid the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface of my everyday life. But even as I tried to forget about the strange woman, there was a lingering sense of unease that followed me. My dad had been acting differently, too. He wasn't quite as chatty as he usually was, and every now and then, I'd catch him staring off into the distance, lost in thought. Whenever I brought up the woman, he would change the subject quickly, almost like he didn't want to talk about it. That only made me more curious. It wasn't until the following spring, a few months later, that everything came to a head. I was sitting in my room one afternoon, reading a book, when I heard my dad's voice yelling from the living room. "Son, get in here, quick!" I jumped up, startled, and ran into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad was sitting on the couch, his eyes wide as he pointed at the TV. "Look at this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. I followed his gaze to the screen, where a news anchor was reading a report. I wasn't sure what had him so worked up, but when I looked at the image on the screen, my blood went cold. It was a mugshot of a woman, and my stomach dropped as soon as I saw her face. "That's her," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The woman from the gas station, the one who had come in asking for a ride, the one who had looked at me with those unsettling eyes. I couldn't believe it. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The news anchor continued, oblivious to my shock. "Authorities have arrested Sharon Wells, a 38-year-old woman from Jacksonville, on charges of being connected to a string of murders across Florida." Wells is believed to have been operating under several aliases and has been on the run for the past year. She was captured after being identified in a surveillance video from a gas station in Ocala. My dad sat frozen, his face pale as the news unfolded. I felt a chill run down my spine. It couldn't be a coincidence. This woman, this stranger who had come into our gas station just months before, was a murderer. I could hardly process it. My dad's voice broke the silence. "That's her," he said again, his tone thick with disbelief. I knew something was wrong. When she walked in that night, I just felt it. I had a bad feeling about her the second I saw her coming up the driveway. I should have done more to stop her. I looked at my dad, trying to make sense of it all. But how did she get away? We could have called the cops. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "But I just didn't trust her. I don't know why. I didn't want to take any chances, so I told her to leave. But I never expected this." His voice trailed off, and for the first time, I saw the weight of regret in his eyes. The news anchor continued reading, but my thoughts were elsewhere. My mind was racing, trying to process the details. Sharon Wells had been caught after a year on the run, connected to multiple murders. The part that hit me the hardest was the mention of Ocala, a city that wasn't far from us. It felt like the universe had thrown a curveball, connecting everything back to that one strange night. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Sharon Wells hadn't just been stranded on the side of the road. She hadn't just needed a ride. She had been scouting. She had been sizing me up, figuring out who she could manipulate into giving her the ride she needed to continue her crime spree. And I had almost fallen for it. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right in front of me. Sharon Wells was a serial killer. She had been roaming the state, preying on unsuspecting victims, and I had almost been one of them. I shuddered at the thought, my mind spiraling with all the what-ifs. I kept replaying that night in my head, thinking of all the little things I hadn't noticed before. The way she'd looked at me, the way she'd tried to convince my dad that I could drive her. She had been playing a game I hadn't even realized I was part of. But that wasn't the only thing that bothered me. It was the timing. I'd seen her just before everything started to unravel. If I hadn't been so naive, if I had pressed my dad to help her, what would have happened? What if I had been the one to drive her to Ocala? What if we hadn't caught her in time? That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions, and the weight of what had almost happened pressed down on me like a 1,000-pound stone. I had always been told to trust people, to be kind, but in that moment, I realized how dangerous it could be to let your guard down. I wasn't just a kid anymore. I was learning the hard way that the world wasn't as safe as I had thought. The days that followed were a blur. Sharon Wells had been arrested, and the news stories about her began to flood the local media. As the police pieced together her history, more details came to light. She had been living under multiple aliases, moving from town to town, always staying one step ahead of the authorities. It was like she had been playing a game of cat and mouse, and we had been the unsuspecting mice. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What had she wanted from us? Had she really been stranded? Or had she been looking for her next victim? It was hard to know. But what I did know was that my dad had trusted his instincts that night. He had known something was wrong, and he had acted on it, even though it wasn't easy. A few weeks later, I found out that Sharon Wells wasn't the only one. The police had uncovered a whole network of individuals involved in similar crimes, people who had been operating in the shadows, using fake identities to prey on vulnerable targets. I learned that the gas station had been one of the places she'd been to during her spree. She had walked in with the intent to use me as a pawn, but my dad had stopped her. In the end, Sharon Wells was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The whole town was shaken by the news, but there was a strange sense of relief too. The monster had been caught. The danger had passed. Or so we thought. But even now, years later,
I still think back to that night. I still think about the way Sharon Wells had looked at me, the way she had tried to charm her way into my dad's trust. I still wonder what would have happened if I had said yes. Would I have been just another victim? Or would I have been able to stop her? I'll never know. All I know is this: I'll never take that kind of chance again. People aren't always what they seem. And sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who can blend into the background, hiding their true intentions until it's almost too late. I don't think I'll ever forget Sharon Wells or the lessons she taught me. It's a dark chapter in my life, one that I never expected to be part of, but it's one that shaped who I am today. And for that, I'm grateful, though I wish I could forget the fear that still lingers in my chest when I think about how close I came to being one of her victims. The days that followed Sharon Wells' arrest felt like a strange blur. On one hand, there was a sense of relief that the monster who had been lurking in the shadows was finally caught. But on the other hand, there was a gnawing unease that never seemed to fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that maybe we had all missed something, or worse, that maybe there was more to the story than anyone knew. Life at the gas station slowly returned to normal. My dad went back to his usual routine of working long hours, chatting with customers, and managing the small store. He still had that distant look in his eyes, though. It was like he was processing everything that had happened, even if he never spoke about it. I had learned to leave it alone, but I could see the weight he carried around, the way he would pause and stare off into the distance sometimes, lost in thought. For my part, I tried to focus on the usual teenage distractions. I spent time with my friends, went to school, and tried to pretend like everything was normal. But every time I closed my eyes, Sharon Wells' face would flash before me. The mugshot, the cold, calculating look in her eyes, and the memory of her walking into the gas station kept replaying over and over again in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to becoming one of her victims. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after her arrest, I was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine, when my dad walked in with a serious look on his face. I had grown used to seeing him like this lately, but there was something different this time, an urgency in his step, a tense air about him. "Son, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and careful. I set the magazine down, my stomach dropping. "What's wrong, Dad?" He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about that woman, Sharon Wells. There's something you don't know, something I haven't told you." I felt a jolt of fear run through me. I had known something was off. I had known that there was more to the story than what was being told. But I hadn't expected my dad to say this. My heart started to pound. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My dad sat down heavily across from me. His eyes were tired, and for the first time, I saw the weight of years in his face. After Wells was arrested, I did some digging. You know, just to find out more about her. I wanted to know what kind of person she really was. Turns out, there's more to her than anyone realized. I leaned in, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? More than what? What did you find out?" Dad hesitated for a moment, like he was deciding whether or not to continue. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost as if he didn't want anyone to hear. "I found out that Sharon Wells wasn't just a random drifter passing through. She was connected to something much darker, something bigger than what anyone in this town knows." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had always known there was something wrong with her, something sinister hiding behind her eyes. But now, it seemed that my dad's suspicions were deeper than I had realized. "What do you mean connected?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Wells wasn't working alone," my dad said, his eyes narrowing. "She had a partner, someone else who was helping her, someone who had been right here in this town with us, for months, maybe even longer."
The words hit me like a punch to the gut. A partner? That didn't make any sense. How could someone have been hiding in plain sight? How could we have missed it? Who? I asked, my throat dry. Who was she working with? I don't know yet, Dad said, his face grim. But I'm going to find out. I think there's more to this story than anyone realizes. I've been digging into Wells' past, and I found some things that don't add up. I think she and her partner were using this town as a base of operations. They were planning something, and I think they were going to target more people, maybe even you. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what he was saying. A partner? A second person? It felt like my whole world was turning upside down. I had always thought of the events as a strange coincidence, something that had happened by chance. But now, my dad was suggesting that there had been a deliberate plan, that everything, Sharon Wells' appearance at the gas station, her strange behavior, even the way she'd tried to get me to drive her, had been part of a larger scheme. And the thought of being a target, of almost becoming one of their victims, made my stomach churn. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked, my voice shaky. Why didn't you warn me? Dad's eyes softened, and for a moment he looked like the man I had always known. I didn't want to scare you, son. You were already shaken up enough. I didn't want to make it worse. But after thinking about it, I realized that you need to know. You need to be prepared, just in case. I nodded, though the words didn't seem to reach me. My mind was reeling. Sharon Wells hadn't just been some random killer passing through. She had been part of a network, a group of people who had been plotting something much darker than I could have ever imagined. I'm going to talk to the police, Dad said after a long pause. I'm going to get to the bottom of this, and I want you to be careful. Keep your eyes open. Trust no one. The next few days were a blur of questions and uncertainty. My dad continued his quiet investigation, meeting with local law enforcement and digging into Sharon Wells' past. It seemed like every time he uncovered a new detail, it only made the situation more confusing. Sharon Wells had been living under false identities for years, moving from town to town, and it wasn't until recently that the authorities had connected her to a string of disappearances across the state. But there was still no trace of her accomplice, no clue as to who they might be or where they could be hiding. As much as I tried to put the pieces together, I couldn't. The more I learned, the less sense it made. It felt like we were all just pawns in a much bigger game, one that we didn't understand and couldn't control. Then, one night, just as I was beginning to think that maybe it was all over, that maybe Sharon Wells was the last of her kind, the phone rang. It was past midnight, and I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. I heard the shrill sound of the phone echo through the house, and I rushed to pick it up before it woke anyone else. "Hello?" I said, my voice thick with sleep. "Is this the Williams residence?" A woman's voice crackled over the line. "This is Detective Martinez from the Jacksonville Police Department. Is Mr. Williams there?" I froze. Jacksonville? That was the city where Sharon Wells had been from. What could the police want with my dad at this hour? "Hold on, I'll get him," I said quickly, my heart racing. I went to my dad's room and shook him awake, urging him to take the call. He groggily answered the phone, and I could hear the conversation in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. My dad's face grew more and more serious as he listened. Finally, he hung up the phone and turned to me, his expression grim. "Son, we've got a problem." "Is it about Sharon Wells?" I asked, dreading the answer. Dad nodded. "It's worse than we thought. The police just found something. They think Wells and her partner were planning something much bigger. They've been working together for years, and now we're in their crosshairs. It's not over yet." My stomach dropped. The nightmare was far from over, and now it seemed like it was coming for us. "Stay close, son," my dad said quietly. "Things are about to get a lot more dangerous." The phone call from Detective Martinez had changed everything. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sick, tight knot in my stomach that seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. The revelation that Sharon Wells's plans were far from over had put us all on edge. My dad was more distant than ever, and I could see the lines of worry etched deeper on his face. It was clear that he didn't want to talk about it, but I knew that this wasn't something that could be ignored. I didn't know who I was more afraid of, the police, who now seemed to think we were somehow connected to whatever Sharon Wells had been involved in, or the shadows of the past, which seemed to be closing in on us from all directions. Either way, I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the unknown. The days after the phone call passed in a haze. Dad had stopped going to work, or at least he stopped going to the gas station at his usual hours. He said it was for my safety, that we needed to stay low for a while. But I knew it wasn't just about me. It was about him too. It was clear that he was afraid. We spent most of our days inside, keeping the blinds drawn, avoiding any unnecessary contact with the outside world. My friends tried to reach out, but I kept pushing them away. I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. Every time I asked Dad for more details about the situation, he shut down. It was the first time I'd seen him so closed off, so vulnerable. The man who had always been the calm, unshakable figure in my life was now a man haunted by something I couldn't understand. And the more I watched him, the more I realized that there was something deeper at play. Sharon Wells wasn't the end of the nightmare. It was just the beginning. The turning point came one Saturday evening. The sky had darkened early, the clouds heavy with the threat of rain. My dad had just finished pacing the living room for the third time when the knock at the door came. It wasn't a normal knock. It wasn't even a polite one. It was insistent, forceful, almost like someone was demanding to be let in. Dad froze, his eyes widening as if he'd been expecting it. His hand shot out to grab the baseball bat that always leaned against the doorframe, and he motioned for me to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I didn't argue. My heart pounded in my chest as I retreated into the shadows of the hallway. I held my breath, praying that whoever was at the door would go away. But there was no such luck. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice. It was a woman's voice, low and insistent. "We know you're in there, Mr. Williams. Open up." My heart stopped. The voice sounded so familiar. I recognized it instantly. It was Sharon Wells. Or at least, it sounded like her. But that couldn't be possible. She was in jail. She couldn't be standing outside our door. "Dad," I whispered, but my voice barely made a sound. My throat was dry, tight with fear. Dad was already motioning for me to stay quiet, his face pale. His eyes flicked toward the window. I followed his gaze and saw a dark silhouette outside, standing just out of view of the porch light. Whoever it was, they were waiting for us to make a move. My dad didn't say a word, but I could tell he was calculating his options. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity. My dad's breathing was shallow, his hand still gripping the bat tightly. He stood there, frozen in time, until finally, he made a decision. With a sudden motion, he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back of the house. "Go to the garage," he hissed. "Stay there until I tell you it's safe. Don't make a sound." I didn't need to be told twice. My legs were already in motion before his words fully registered in my mind. I slipped through the hallway, past the back door, and into the dark garage, my heart thundering in my chest. I crouched down behind the old rusted car, hoping that the shadows would hide me. From where I was, I could hear the muffled voices from the front door, but I couldn't make out the words. Then suddenly, I heard a loud bang, a door slamming open, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew it would only make things worse. I held my breath, praying that no one would find me. The footsteps grew closer, and then everything went silent. I didn't move, not an inch. For what felt like hours, I stayed huddled in the dark, the sound of my own heartbeat deafening in my ears. But eventually, I heard the door creak open again, followed by a voice that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Williams, a man's voice said, calm and menacing. "We know you're here. We've been waiting for this. Sharon is just the beginning. If you want to make it out alive, you'll do exactly as we say." I had no idea how long I stayed hidden in that garage. It could have been minutes or hours. It didn't matter. All I could hear was the slow, steady thrum of my heartbeat and the silence that seemed to stretch out into eternity. Finally, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. The footsteps moved away from the house, growing fainter by the second. But I didn't dare move until the world outside felt completely still again. When I finally dared to peek outside, the moonlight revealed an empty driveway. My heart was still racing, but I felt a sliver of hope creeping in. I slowly made my way back into the house, careful to stay low, careful to stay quiet. The silence in the air was deafening. I found my dad sitting on the couch in the living room, his face drawn with exhaustion. His eyes met mine as I walked in, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something in them. Something dark, something terrified. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He stood up, and I noticed the sweat on his forehead. "I think they're gone for now," he said, his voice steady but low. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. My dad's eyes darkened. "Now we fight back." I nodded, trying to push down the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "How? How do we fight back against them?" Dad's eyes hardened as he looked out the window, his mind clearly racing with plans. "We don't have a choice. They're coming for us and we need to be ready." That night, we prepared for what felt like an inevitable showdown. My dad and I spent hours going over everything we knew about Sharon Wells and her partner, every detail, every clue. We researched their backgrounds, the places they'd been, the people they'd interacted with. The more we dug, the clearer it became. These were no ordinary criminals. This was something much bigger, something much darker. The network they were a part of was sprawling, and the people involved were far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. My dad had always been the kind of man who relied on logic, on careful planning. But now, I could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear of not being able to protect me. I knew he was scared. I knew that I was too. But in that moment, something changed. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were hunters. The night passed in tense silence, the weight of our preparations hanging over us. The world outside seemed calm, but I knew it was only the eye of the storm. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin, and we had no choice but to face it head-on. The sun barely touched the horizon when my dad and I set to work, making final preparations for the day ahead. It felt like we were gearing up for a war, and in a way, we were. The world we knew had been shattered overnight, and now we had to face the truth. Sharon Wells and the people who had come looking for us weren't just some random criminals. They were part of something much darker, something that stretched across borders and had ties we couldn't begin to understand. As the hours passed and the early morning light began to creep across the driveway, I felt the heaviness of the situation settle in. I kept replaying the words the man had spoken last night, his voice dripping with malice. "If you want to make it out alive, you'll do exactly as we say." It was a threat, but it was more than that. It was a promise. They weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted, and I was terrified that what they wanted was us. Dad had spent most of the night researching, making phone calls to people I didn't recognize, people who might be able to help us. The phone conversations were brief, but filled with urgency. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he simply told me that it was better I didn't know. The less I knew, the safer I would be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. If Sharon Wells and her associates had already found us, how long until the others came looking? "I think it's time," Dad said abruptly, breaking my thoughts. He stood by the door, his coat already on, the weight of the gun at his side making him look more like a soldier than a man just trying to protect his family. His eyes met mine, steady but filled with a darkness I hadn't seen before. "We can't wait any longer. They'll come for us today, and we need to be ready." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for this. But the reality was that we didn't have a choice. We had to face it. We had spent the past few hours fortifying the house. Every door and window had been checked, reinforced, and locked. Dad had pulled out the old weapons stash that had been tucked away for years. Guns, knives, even a couple of crossbows. It felt surreal to be holding them, like we were suddenly thrust into a nightmare. But it was the only way we could be sure we stood a chance. "You stay here," Dad instructed as he handed me the shotgun. It was a heavy thing, the barrel thick and worn from years of use. "I'll be in the yard. Watch the back door. Don't open it for anyone unless you're absolutely sure." "I'm not letting you do this alone," I replied, my voice firm despite the fear that gripped my chest. Dad hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I could see the doubt in them, the concern. "This isn't something you should be involved in. It's dangerous, and I won't let you—" "I'm not letting you do this alone," I repeated, my voice stronger this time. There was no arguing with me, not when I was sure about something. He knew that. He finally nodded, his jaw tight, and together we made our way to the backyard, where the dense woods loomed like a dark, impenetrable wall. There was something unsettling about them, something alive in the shadows between the trees. My dad had always said the woods were safe, that they were our territory. But now, looking at them through the haze of fear and adrenaline, they felt like a trap waiting to spring. We moved quickly, silently, sticking to the edges of the house. My heart raced, and every rustle of the wind, every distant bird call, seemed like a warning. "You've got your eyes open?" Dad asked, his voice low, the kind of whisper that didn't carry but still felt like an order. He always spoke that way when he was in survival mode. I nodded, my fingers tightening on the shotgun, the weight of it grounding me in the present. "Yeah, I'm watching." We crouched behind the garden shed, our eyes scanning the tree line, waiting for the first sign of movement. The world around us was eerily quiet, too quiet. I kept expecting to hear the hum of cars passing on the highway or the distant chatter of people, but the silence pressed in like a thick fog. "Dad, do you think they know where we are?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then he sighed. "They're not just looking for us, kid. They're looking for something else. They're looking for something much bigger. Something connected to Sharon Wells." My stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Dad didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the trees, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something in the distance. "They didn't just target Sharon," he finally said. "They've been targeting people for years. I've been involved in something that I thought was over, but it's not. And now they're coming for us." I didn't know what to say. I could see the regret in his eyes, the weight of everything he had kept from me for so long. But now wasn't the time for explanations. We both froze as a car engine revved in the distance. The sound was faint at first, almost too far to be real, but it grew louder, closer. My pulse spiked. This was it. Dad's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist and pulling me closer. "Get ready," he whispered. "Stay behind the shed. Don't let them see you." I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. I had never been in a situation like this, never been this close to danger. My whole life had been a bubble, a world of normalcy that had now burst wide open. The car engine grew louder, closer. I could hear the tires crunching on the gravel, the sound unmistakable. And then they appeared. 2 black SUVs, their headlights cutting through the dark morning. They rolled slowly down the driveway, their engines purring like predators stalking their prey. I could see the silhouettes inside, but they were too far to make out any details. The vehicles came to a stop just short of the house, and the doors opened with eerie synchrony. A handful of figures emerged, moving with purpose, their faces obscured by the shadows. "They're here," Dad muttered under his breath. I felt a lump form in my throat. This wasn't just about Sharon Wells anymore. Whoever they weren't going to leave until they had what they came for. And I wasn't sure what that was, but I had a feeling it had something to do with us. The figures moved quickly, fanning out across the yard, their footsteps heavy but deliberate. They were professionals. I could see it in the way they moved, in the way they held their weapons, in the way they scanned the area. "Stay low," Dad hissed, pressing his back against the shed, his hand on my shoulder. "Let them pass. We don't want them to know we're here." I tried to steady my breathing, my fingers tightening around the shotgun. I could hear the murmurs of their voices now, but the words were lost in the wind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the intent was clear. They were searching, and they were getting closer. I didn't have time to think. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me, my instincts kicking in. I raised the shotgun, preparing for what was coming. My dad didn't need to say a word. We were both ready. Suddenly, one of the figures broke away from the group, heading straight toward the shed. My pulse raced. "Now," Dad whispered, and we sprang into action. The figure didn't even have time to react. Dad was on him first, tackling him to the ground with the force of a freight train. I was right behind him, leveling the shotgun at the other figures who had started to rush toward us. I wasn't a soldier, I wasn't a trained fighter, but I didn't need to be. I just needed to survive. I squeezed the trigger. The sound of the gunshot shattered the silence, and the figure I'd aimed at dropped to the ground. I didn't hesitate. I aimed at another one and fired again. This time the figure staggered backward, a look of shock on his face before he collapsed. But the others were still coming. The hunt had begun, and we were no longer the prey. The tension in the air was suffocating. My ears were ringing from the shotgun blasts, and my hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the weapon, waiting for the next move. The silence that followed the chaos was almost worse than the noise. I could hear the heavy breathing of my dad, still grappling with the man on the ground, his arms locked around the intruder's neck, ensuring he wouldn't get up. I couldn't let my guard down. The others were still out there, and they were not going to stop until they had whatever it was they came for. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. The woods, the backyard, the driveway, all felt like traps now. We were cornered. I glanced at my dad. His face was set in a grim expression, sweat trickling down his forehead as he held the man to the ground with surprising strength. The rest of the attackers were trying to regroup, but they hadn't expected us to fight back. They didn't know who they were up against. "We have to move, Dad," I hissed, my voice barely audible over the chaos. He nodded but didn't let go of the man. "Go to the shed. Now." Without waiting for a second command, I moved, slipping into the shadows as quietly as I could. My eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement. The remaining attackers were crouching low, their weapons raised, eyes searching the yard. They weren't going to let us get away, and they wouldn't hesitate to finish what they had started. The shed was my only option. It had always been there, standing in the corner of the yard like a forgotten relic, but now it felt like the last safe place. I sprinted toward it, keeping low to the ground, my breath coming in short gasps. As I reached the door, I could hear the creak of the hinges. The last thing I needed was to alert them to my position. Inside, I found what I was looking for, a rusty old rifle my dad had kept in storage just in case. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. I didn't know if I was ready for what was coming, but I knew I had no choice. I gripped the rifle tightly, the weight of it grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't powerless. I had to fight. I had to protect us. The sounds of the attackers closing in were unmistakable. They were almost here. I steadied my breathing, aiming through the small cracks in the shed's walls. I could see their figures moving in the distance, their heads scanning for signs of life. The tension was unbearable. My finger hovered over the trigger. Then I heard it. A familiar voice, urgent and quiet, coming from the other side of the yard. 'Don't shoot. It's me.' I froze. The sound of the gun shot shattered the silence, and the figure I aimed at dropped to the ground. I didn't hesitate. I aimed at another one and fired again. The
lowering the rifle. It was my dad. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to the door, throwing it open just enough to see him crouching near the fence, his eyes wide and frantic. "Dad?" I whispered, almost in disbelief. "We've got to go," he said urgently, looking around. "There are more of them. They know we're here, and they won't stop." I nodded, my mind racing. We had to make it to the car. We had to get out. But the moment I turned to move toward the driveway, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal. A figure stepped out of the trees, and then another, and another. They were surrounding us. The people in the woods, they weren't just criminals. They were something else. They were relentless, and they were everywhere. I knew in that moment that there was no escaping them, not unless we fought back with everything we had. I turned back to my dad. "We don't have much time." He was already moving, his face hard with resolve. "Get to the car. I'll cover you." I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, the sound of my boots pounding against the dirt ringing in my ears. My heart felt like it was going to burst, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I didn't know how much longer we had before they closed in, but we couldn't let them catch us. Not after everything we'd been through. When I reached the car, I yanked open the door and slid behind the wheel, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I could see my dad now, moving back and forth between the trees, firing the shotgun at anything that moved. I could hear the distant crack of gunfire, the low mutter of his voice as he shouted commands to me. "Go, kid! Get out of here!" I started the engine, the roar of the car filling my ears. My hands shook, but I shoved the car into gear, my foot slamming down on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the gravel, but I didn't care. We had to get away. We had to leave this nightmare behind us. As I sped down the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the figures in the distance, emerging from the trees like shadows. They were too close. Then I heard it. A deafening explosion of sound. Gunfire, loud and close. I twisted the wheel to the left, slamming the gas pedal to the floor, but my eyes never left the rearview mirror. I saw my dad still fighting, still holding his ground. But there were too many of them. The odds were stacked against us. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went quiet. The gunfire stopped. The figures disappeared into the woods, like they had never been there. I didn't stop the car. I couldn't. We had to keep moving. We had made it. For now. But as the town faded behind us, and the trees swallowed up the house we had once called home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The people we had fought weren't just a group of criminals. They were a force that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And no matter how far we ran, no matter how fast we drove, I knew they would keep coming for us. The car sped down the highway, and I could feel the weight of it settling on my shoulders. My dad was quiet now, watching the road ahead, his face grim. He didn't say a word, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching for any sign of danger. We were survivors, but we were also marked. And as the sun began to rise, casting the world in a soft, golden light, I realized that the fight was far from over. We had made it out, but we hadn't won. Not yet. It had been years since I'd last gone camping. Life after college had grown busier with every passing day. My friends and I, once inseparable during our weekend adventures, were now scattered across cities, caught up in jobs, relationships, and responsibilities. Those carefree trips into the wilderness felt like distant memories, and the urge to escape the monotony of daily life was gnawing at me. One Friday evening, as I sat on my couch, scrolling through old photos, I stumbled upon an album titled Campfire Chronicles. Each picture was a snapshot of better times, laughing around a blazing fire, hiking trails that seemed to stretch forever, gazing at the stars under an infinite sky. I missed those moments, missed the freedom, missed the silence of the woods. It was then I made up my mind.
I would go camping again, alone. The next morning, I began preparing for the trip. I dusted off my old camping gear, checked the condition of my tent, and restocked my backpack with essentials. The destination was an easy choice, the same secluded spot my friends and I used to visit. It wasn't the most accessible location, 3 hours of driving followed by an hour-long hike, but that was the appeal. The isolation meant no crowds, no noise, just me and nature. By mid-afternoon, I was on the road. The city slowly faded in my rear-view mirror, replaced by rolling hills and dense patches of forest. With each passing mile, I felt the weight of my routine life lift a little. The sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the landscape as I parked my car near the trailhead and began the hike. The trail was exactly how I remembered it, narrow, winding, and surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. I walked slowly, letting the sounds of the forest fill my ears, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was peaceful, almost meditative. About an hour later, I arrived at the clearing. It was just as I'd pictured it, a flat, open space ringed by trees, with enough room to set up camp and a few fallen logs perfect for sitting. The air smelled fresh, tinged with the earthy scent of moss and damp wood. I smiled to myself, feeling a wave of nostalgia. I set up my tent near the center of the clearing, where the ground was even. It took a little longer than I'd expected. I was out of practice, but soon enough, my little campsite was ready. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I decided to gather some firewood before it got too dark. As I wandered the edge of the clearing, collecting sticks and logs, I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but then I saw him. A man, walking toward the clearing. He emerged from the trees slowly, almost cautiously. He was of average build, wearing a faded jacket and cargo pants. His boots were scuffed, and he carried a small, worn backpack over one shoulder. Something about him seemed off. For starters, he didn't have any camping gear, no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing you'd expect someone to bring if they planned to stay overnight. "Hey," I called out, raising a hand in greeting. "Everything okay?" He looked at me but didn't say a word. His face was expressionless, his eyes dull. After a few seconds, he gave a slight nod and walked to the far side of the clearing. He sat down on a fallen log, his back to me, and stared into the forest. I watched him for a moment, unsure of what to make of the situation. People went hiking for all kinds of reasons, some to escape, some to find peace, others for the challenge. Maybe he was just passing through and needed a break. Still, the way he moved and his silence unsettled me. I shook off the feeling and went back to my firewood. By the time I returned to the center of the clearing, the man hadn't moved. I decided to leave him alone. If he wanted to talk, he would. I wasn't going to push. As the sun began to set, I lit a small fire. The warmth was comforting, and the crackling flames filled the silence. I boiled water on my camping stove and prepared a freeze-dried meal. Nothing fancy, just something to keep my energy up. The smell of food made me feel a bit more at ease, but I couldn't ignore the presence of the stranger at the edge of the clearing. I glanced over at him occasionally. He hadn't moved an inch since he sat down. His stillness was unnatural, like he was a statue. The firelight didn't reach that far, so he was partially shrouded in shadow, adding to the eeriness. After dinner, I tried to relax. I leaned back against a log, staring up at the sky. The stars were starting to appear, tiny pinpricks of light in the darkening expanse. Normally, this would have been my favorite part of camping, just sitting in silence, soaking in the beauty of the night. But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The man stood up just as the last light of day faded. My heart skipped a beat as I watched him walk toward the edge of the clearing, the same direction he'd come from. He didn't look back.
didn't acknowledge me. Within seconds, he disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the darkness. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The clearing felt different now, emptier, but somehow heavier. I tried to tell myself that it didn't matter, that he was gone, and I could enjoy the rest of my trip in peace. But the unease lingered. As the night deepened, I decided to turn in. I extinguished the fire, leaving only the faint glow of my small lantern hanging on the side of my tent. Inside, I unrolled my sleeping bag and lay down, staring at the nylon ceiling. The sounds of the forest had returned, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves. But they felt distant, almost muted. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then I realized the steps were too deliberate, too human. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped just outside my tent. I reached for my lantern and fumbled to turn it on. The soft glow illuminated the inside of my tent, but I couldn't see outside. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. There he was. The man was standing about 20 feet away, in the exact spot where he'd been sitting earlier. His posture was rigid, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Is something wrong?" He didn't respond. He didn't move. I couldn't even tell if he was breathing. I grabbed my pocket knife, clutching it tightly as I stepped out of the tent. The night was pitch black, save for the faint light of the lantern. I kept my eyes locked on him, my mind racing. Why was he back? What did he want? "Look, man, if you need help or something, just say so," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Still nothing. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away. His movements were slow, almost robotic, as he disappeared into the forest once again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by my tent, knife in hand, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear and left as quickly as I could. The morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of trees, casting long, dappled shadows on the forest floor. I hadn't slept a wink, my mind racing with questions about the man who had appeared in the clearing twice during the night. Who was he? Why had he been there, silent and staring? Every thought spiraled into another until I felt like I was trapped in an endless loop of unease. I packed my gear in record time, my hands trembling as I stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my backpack. The silence of the forest, which I had always found comforting, now felt suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing around the clearing, half expecting the man to reappear, standing motionless among the trees. By the time I started my hike back to the trailhead, the sun was fully up, casting a golden glow on the world around me. Normally, this would be the part of the trip where I'd savor the beauty of nature. But now, all I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and the clearing. The hike back was uneventful but tense. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Though every time I stopped and looked around, the forest was empty. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across the trail, but there was no sign of the man. When I finally reached my car, I let out a sigh of relief. The sight of the dusty old vehicle felt like a lifeline, a connection to the safety of civilization. Tossing my backpack into the trunk, I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I started the engine, the familiar hum calming my frayed nerves. As I pulled onto the dirt road that led back to town, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The trees blurred past, but for a split second, I thought I saw something. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trail. My stomach twisted, but I didn't stop to confirm. I pressed the gas pedal harder, eager to leave the forest behind. By the time I got home, It was early afternoon. The first thing I did was lock every door and window in my apartment. It felt silly, paranoid even, but I couldn't help it. The memory of the man's blank stare and eerie silence was burned into my mind. I collapsed onto my couch, exhausted but too wired to sleep. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a reminder that I had messages from friends and coworkers I hadn't replied to. Normally I'd ignore them, but today I needed a distraction. One message caught my eye, a group chat with my old camping buddies. It had been dormant for months, but someone had sent a photo of an old trail map. "Hey, remember this place? Good times." The timing was too perfect to ignore. I typed out a quick reply. "Yeah, I actually went camping near there last night, alone this time. Weirdest thing happened though." I hesitated before sending it, unsure of how much I wanted to share. Would they think I was overreacting? I decided to keep it vague. "Ran into a guy out there. Didn't seem like he was camping, just stood around. Kind of freaked me out." Within minutes, the replies started rolling in. Ben. "Wait, what? You went back there alone? Dude, you're braver than I am." Maya. "Was he dangerous? Did he say anything?" Sam. "Sounds creepy as hell. You sure he wasn't just another camper?" I explained the encounter as best I could, leaving out how terrified I'd been. The responses ranged from concern to disbelief. Ben. "Maybe he was just lost? Or looking for a quiet spot to chill?" Maya. "Still, that's so weird. You should have reported it." Sam. "Or maybe it's a ghost." I laughed at Sam's joke, but the unease lingered. What if it wasn't just some harmless hiker? What if there was more to his presence? The next few days passed uneventfully. I went back to work, caught up with friends, and tried to push the encounter out of my mind. But the memory refused to fade. At night, I found myself double-checking the locks on my doors and windows, staring into the darkness outside as if expecting to see the man's face peering in. It wasn't until a week later that things took a turn. It started with small things. I'd come home from work and find items in my apartment slightly out of place. A chair pulled out from the dining table, a book moved from the shelf, a window unlocked when I was sure I'd locked it. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I'd been too distracted, too preoccupied with the camping trip to notice what I was doing. But then the dreams began. Every night I'd find myself back in the clearing, sitting by the fire. The man would be there, standing at the edge of the light, watching me. In the dreams, he always spoke, but his voice was low and garbled, like a recording played backward. I could never understand what he was saying, but his presence filled me with a deep, primal fear. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The dreams were so vivid that I could almost smell the smoke from the fire, feel the cool night air on my skin. One morning, after another restless night, I decided to do some research. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man's presence meant something, that there was more to him than met the eye. I started by looking up the history of the area where I'd camped. It turned out the forest had a long and somewhat dark history. In the early 1900s, it had been home to a small logging community that had mysteriously disappeared. The only remnants of the settlement were a few crumbling foundations and rusted tools scattered throughout the woods. Rumors of hauntings and strange occurrences had persisted for decades. Hikers reported hearing footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. Others claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving through the trees. One story, in particular, caught my attention. It was about a man who had gone camping alone in the same area and had returned with tales of being watched by a silent figure. The descriptions matched the man I'd encountered almost exactly. Average build, worn clothes, a blank stare. The deeper I dug, the more uneasy I became. Could it have been the same man? Was he connected to the forest's strange history? Or was it all just a coincidence, my mind playing tricks on me? I decided to reach out to the group chat again, this time sharing what I'd found.
Me. So, remember the guy I mentioned? Did some digging, and apparently, that area has a weird history. People disappearing, sightings of figures in the woods. Kinda freaky. The responses were immediate. Ben. That's wild. You think it's the same guy? Maya. Maybe he's some kind of urban legend, like Slender Man or something. Sam. Or maybe he's real and you're next. I rolled my eyes at Sam's comment, but a chill ran down my spine. What if he was right? That evening, as I sat on my couch scrolling through more articles, I heard a noise outside my window. It was faint, like the crunch of gravel underfoot, but enough to make me freeze. I slowly got up and approached the window, peering through the curtains. The street outside was empty, lit only by the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. But something felt off. I locked the window and pulled the curtains tightly shut. My heart was pounding as I double-checked the locks on my front door and bedroom windows. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. This time, the man wasn't just standing at the edge of the clearing. He was closer, his face partially illuminated by the firelight. His eyes were empty, his lips moving silently. When I woke up, the fear was suffocating. I couldn't stay here, couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. And deep down, I knew the forest was calling me back. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The events of the past week had left me exhausted, mentally and physically. As I sat at the edge of my bed rubbing my temples, I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine if I ignored it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The man, the strange happenings in my apartment, the dreams, they were all connected, and ignoring them would only make things worse. The forest was calling me back, though I couldn't explain why. I spent the day preparing, my mind oscillating between fear and determination. I packed the essentials: a flashlight, extra batteries, a sturdy knife, my camping gear, and a notebook to document anything unusual. This time, I'd be ready for whatever, or whoever, was out there. By late afternoon, I was on the road, the forest looming in the distance like a dark, silent specter. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I approached the trailhead. The parking area was empty, just as it had been the last time. The sight of my own car parked there alone sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, I considered turning back, but something inside me, curiosity, stubbornness, or perhaps something deeper, kept me moving forward. I shouldered my backpack and stepped onto the trail, the familiar crunch of gravel underfoot oddly comforting. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual symphony of bird song and rustling leaves muted as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. As I hiked, the memories of my last trip came rushing back. Every twist and turn of the trail felt like déjà vu, the trees standing like silent witnesses to whatever was happening. The clearing wasn't far now. My pulse quickened as I thought about what I might find. When I reached the clearing, it was just as I'd left it, peaceful, almost serene, but with an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't shake. I set up my tent in the same spot and built a small fire in the center of the clearing, the flames crackling and casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. As night fell, I sat by the fire, the notebook open in my lap. I jotted down every detail I could remember about the man, the dreams, and the strange occurrences at home. The act of writing felt grounding, a way to make sense of the chaos. But as the hours ticked by, the forest seemed to grow darker, the silence more oppressive. The firelight didn't reach as far as it should have, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. It was close to midnight when I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, straining to see beyond the ring of firelight. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse and shaky, barely louder than a whisper. There was no response, only the soft crunch of leaves, as the footsteps came closer. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. I scanned the edge of the clearing, the flashlight trembling in my hand. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty forest. But then, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw him, the man. He stood motionless, half hidden by the trees, his blank stare fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, my voice breaking. He didn't respond. The fire crackled, the only sound in the oppressive silence. I took a step forward, my knife clutched tightly in one hand, the flashlight in the other. "I'm not afraid of you," I lied. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering my words. Then, without warning, he turned and walked into the forest, his figure swallowed by the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every flicker of the fire, set my nerves on edge. The man's presence lingered in the clearing, an invisible weight that refused to leave.
When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear and started back toward the trailhead. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest seemed alive, its branches reaching out like skeletal hands, its shadows twisting and writhing in the corner of my vision. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding as I fought the urge to run. But no matter how fast I moved, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. About halfway back to the trailhead, I saw it, a crude wooden structure partially hidden among the trees. It looked like some kind of shelter, hastily built from fallen branches and covered in moss. Curiosity warred with fear as I approached, my knife ready in case the man was inside. The structure was empty, but what I found inside made my stomach churn. Scattered across the floor were torn scraps of fabric, rusted tools, and what looked like animal bones. But the most disturbing thing was a collection of crude drawings scrawled on the wooden walls. They depicted figures standing in a circle, their faces blank and featureless. In the center of the circle was a larger figure, its limbs elongated and twisted, its face obscured by jagged lines. The drawing sent a chill down my spine. What did they mean? Who had made them? I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking. As I stepped back outside, the forest felt different, darker, heavier. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if I'd crossed some invisible boundary I wasn't meant to. The rest of the hike back was a blur. I reached the trailhead just as the sun was setting, the sight of my car a welcome relief. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left the forest behind. That night, back in my apartment, the dreams returned. This time they were more vivid than ever. I was in the clearing again, but the fire was out, and the man was closer, his face partially illuminated by the moonlight. He spoke, his voice low and distorted. "You've seen it now. You can't run." I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The words echoed in my mind, their meaning unclear but deeply unsettling. I grabbed my phone and looked at the photos I'd taken of the drawings. As I stared at the images, a realization began to take shape, a connection I hadn't seen before. The drawings weren't random. They were a warning. And whatever the man was, he wasn't alone. The days following my return from the forest were a blur of restless nights and fractured thoughts. The unease in my stomach never faded. I kept replaying the dream, the man's cryptic words echoing in my head. "You've seen it now. You can't run." What did that even mean? I found myself staring at the photos from the shelter. Those crude drawings burned into my mind. The more I looked at them, the more I was convinced they weren't just some random marks. They were a map, a warning, a promise. Each figure in the circle, each twisted line, felt deliberate, like someone was trying to tell me something, and I wasn't picking up on it. I tried to go back to my usual routine, but it wasn't the same. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't concentrate when talking to my friends. My thoughts kept drifting back to the man, the shelter, the drawings. It was like I couldn't escape it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum of the city outside my apartment window was deafening, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the dark thoughts that had been creeping in. The strange events were piling up, one on top of the other, and I couldn't figure out how they all fit together. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through the photos of the shelter. I zoomed in on the drawings, my finger trembling as I traced the jagged lines, the circular patterns. They weren't just random images. There was a sense of intention behind them, a message I wasn't seeing. Then something caught my eye. At the bottom of one of the drawings, half hidden by the lines, was a symbol. It wasn't clear at first, buried under layers of scribbled ink, but when I looked closer, I realized it was some kind of rune, like an ancient sigil. It felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I had to know what it meant. The next morning, I found myself walking through the local library, the musty scent of old books wrapping around me. I had no idea why I'd come here, but something deep inside told me I needed to search for answers. I passed through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of books on folklore, mythology, and ancient symbols. I stopped in front of a book that seemed to call to me, the title in faded gold letters, The Hidden Signs, Decoding Ancient Symbols. Without a second thought, I grabbed it from the shelf and made my way to a quiet corner. Flipping through the pages, I came across illustrations of different runes and symbols from various cultures. Some were familiar, like Norse runes or ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, but one in particular made my heart skip a beat. It was the same symbol. I scanned the text, my eyes widening with each word. The symbol wasn't just an ancient marking. It was part of an occult tradition, a symbol used in rituals to summon and control otherworldly forces. In some cultures, it was considered a gateway, a portal between our world and the dark realms beyond. My mind raced as I tried to process the implications. Could the drawings in the shelter be tied to some sort of ritual? Was the man somehow involved in this dark practice? And why had he been watching me? That evening, I sat at my desk, the book open in front of me, my mind spinning with new information. The more I researched, the more I became convinced that the man, or whatever he was, had been drawn to me for a reason. It wasn't just a random encounter in the woods. It was intentional. I kept thinking back to the shelter, to the strange atmosphere that had enveloped me when I stepped inside. There had been something off about it, something wrong. The air had felt thick, heavy, like the space itself was holding its breath. Was the forest a place of power? A place where the boundaries between our world and something else were thinner? I had to go back. The decision hit me hard. My heart pounded as I pulled on my jacket and grabbed my flashlight. I knew it was dangerous, that whatever I was walking into might be something I couldn't escape, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to confront whatever this was. As I drove back to the forest, the memories of the previous trip flooded my mind. The man's face, his vacant stare, the drawing of the twisted figure, their significance was becoming clearer, though I wasn't sure I was ready to face the full truth. When I arrived at the trailhead, I hesitated for only a moment before grabbing my gear and heading into the woods. The familiar path felt different this time, more oppressive, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet as I made my way to the clearing, and the moment I stepped into it, I felt it. The presence. The same feeling I had experienced the last time I was here. The sensation of being watched. I glanced around, my flashlight casting long shadows on the trees. Nothing. But I could feel it. Something was different this time. Something was waiting. I set up my camp in the center of the clearing just like before. But as I started to build the fire, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. I froze,
my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps came closer, and I knew who it was before I even turned around. The man. He emerged from the shadows, just like before, his figure framed by the dark forest. But this time, there was something different about him. He didn't just stand there. He was walking toward me, his face still blank, his movements slow and deliberate. "Why are you following me?" I called out, my voice hoarse. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on mine. The air around us seemed to crackle with tension, and I instinctively reached for the knife at my side. He didn't move. I took a step forward, trying to control the fear clawing at my chest. "What do you want?" He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the shadows once again. I stood there for a long time, staring into the space where he had been. The fire flickered in the silence, and my mind raced. Why had he left so suddenly? What was he trying to tell me? I wasn't alone. I knew that now. Something was pulling at me, something bigger than just the man. The forest itself was hiding secrets, and I was determined to uncover them. But as I packed up my camp and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The symbol, the man, the strange atmosphere, it was all connected, and I was tangled in the middle of it. The road back to my apartment felt longer than it ever had before. The night stretched on, the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness like a knife. When I finally reached my apartment, I sat down at my desk, staring at the photos again. The symbol was there, in my mind and on the paper. It wasn't just a warning, it was a key to something much darker, and I wasn't going to stop until I figured out what it was. The night after my return from the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. The sensation of being watched, the whispers of the trees, and the man's eerie presence haunted my thoughts. I didn't sleep a wink, my mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. What had just happened? Who was that man and why had he come to me? Or more specifically, why had he been following me? And why did I feel as though I was being pulled deeper into something far darker than I could comprehend? It was as if the veil between my world and another had been lifted, just a little, and I was peering through into something I wasn't meant to see. I couldn't stop thinking about the shelter, about the symbol, and about what I'd read in the library. The runes, the ancient rituals, the gateways, they all connected, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even begun to understand. But I had to know more. There was no going back now. The following day, I took the next step. I reached out for help. I wasn't sure who to call at first, but the pull to understand was too strong. I contacted a local expert in occult practices, someone I'd read about online, a scholar of ancient symbols and rituals. Her name was Evelyn Walker, and her work on obscure folklore and occult traditions had caught my attention during my research. I dialed her number, the phone ringing in my ear. I felt a pang of hesitation. What was I even going to say to her? How could I explain that a strange man had been following me, that I had discovered a symbol that connected to ancient rituals, and that now I felt like something was watching me? The line clicked, and a woman's voice, steady and calm, answered. "Evelyn Walker. Hi, my name's Jack. I've been looking into some old symbols, and I came across something strange. I was hoping you could help me." She hesitated for a moment. "What kind of symbols are we talking about?" I took a deep breath. "It's a rune, an ancient symbol. I found it in the woods, at a shelter, an abandoned shelter that seemed wrong. The symbol looks like it's part of some kind of ritual. I think I've stumbled onto something bigger than I can handle on my own." Evelyn was silent for a beat before replying. "Where exactly did you find this shelter, Jack?" I told her the location, the trailhead, the forest, and the clearing. I mentioned the feeling of being watched, the strange man, and the drawings I had seen inside the shelter. I've been to that place before, Evelyn said slowly. It's a known area for those involved in old rituals. That symbol you found, it's part of a darker practice, one that's been whispered about for centuries. It's not something you should be dabbling in, Jack. You're stepping into dangerous territory. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. What do you mean? What's the danger? What is this symbol? Evelyn took a deep breath before speaking again. It's a summoning symbol, Jack. It's used to open doors. Doors between our world and others. Places where things should never cross over. This particular symbol is ancient, dating back to cultures that practiced blood rituals and dark rites. The symbol you found, it's part of a larger picture, and the man you saw, he's likely a participant in this ritual, or someone who's trying to open a door. A cold sweat broke out over me. So you're saying that the man I saw, he's part of some ritual? He was following me because I was connected to it somehow? It's possible, she replied, her voice serious. There are rituals meant to bind certain people to the doorway, to act as either sacrifices or vessels for whatever's on the other side. These kinds of doors don't open easily, but once they're cracked, it's hard to close them again. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Is there anything I can do to stop this? I asked, panic creeping into my voice. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. There is a way to stop it, but it's dangerous. You'll need to go back to the place where you found the symbol, where the ritual is being performed. You'll need to close the door, shut it tight before it opens any wider. But Jack, if you're not careful, you could make things worse. The forces behind these rituals are ancient, and they don't take kindly to interference. I swallowed hard. I don't have a choice, do I? There was a long pause. Then Evelyn sighed. No, you don't. But be careful. Trust your instincts. If you feel something is wrong, get out. Don't risk your life for answers. The rest of the day was a blur. I barely ate or slept. My mind was focused on what Evelyn had told me. The man in the woods, the symbol, the ritual. It was all connected in ways I didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. I couldn't back out now. That night, I packed my things once again. I grabbed the essentials, my flashlight, the knife, the notebook. I also brought a few things Evelyn had suggested. Salt, candles, and a protective charm. She had said that if I was going to confront whatever was on the other side, I needed to be prepared for anything. I arrived at the trailhead the following evening, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest seemed more foreboding this time, the air thick with an unease I couldn't shake. I took a deep breath and began walking the trail, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I neared the clearing, I noticed something odd. There was a faint light flickering through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. Was it the fire from the shelter? I quickened my pace, my senses on high alert. As I emerged into the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The shelter was there, but it was no longer abandoned. Figures cloaked in dark robes stood around the shelter, their faces obscured by hoods. They were chanting, low and rhythmic, their voices blending with the rustling of the trees. The man I had seen earlier was there too, standing at the center of the group, his hands raised toward the sky. The symbol, the one I had found in the shelter, was painted on the ground in a circle around them, glowing faintly in the dim light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This was no longer just a random encounter. This was a ritual, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The wind picked up, swirling around me, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Something was moving in the forest, something darker than the shadows. The chants grew louder, the air heavier. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I backed up slowly, trying to stay out of sight, but my foot slipped on a rock, sending a loud crack echoing through the clearing.
All at once, the chanting stopped. The figures turned toward me, their eyes hidden beneath their hoods, but I could feel their gaze locking onto mine. The man at the center of the circle stepped forward, his face still a blank mask. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice cold and deep. I backed away, panic surging in my chest. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, the trees around me swaying unnaturally. "What do you want?" I gasped. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "We don't need you, but you've seen too much now, and once you've seen the door, there's no turning back." I turned to run, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the earth buckling as if trying to trap me. The shadows moved in closer, encircling me. I could hear their voices now, not just from the cloaked figures, but from something deeper in the forest. Something ancient, something hungry. I didn't know if I could outrun it, but I had to try. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every step I took felt as though I was sinking deeper into something that didn't belong. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, thudding in my ears, but it was drowned out by the strange, eerie silence that followed me. The shadows from the trees seemed to press closer, their twisted forms stretching out like dark fingers trying to grasp me, pull me into their grasp. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every inch of my being screamed for me to run faster, but my legs were heavy, like they were filled with lead. The ground beneath me was shifting, uneven, like it was actively trying to throw me off balance. I stumbled, almost falling, but somehow managed to keep going, my breaths shallow and ragged. The chanting had stopped, but the forest was alive in a way that felt wrong. There was a presence, something that lurked in the darkness, something ancient and hungry. I didn't need to look behind me to know that the figures were still there, watching, waiting. The man at the center of the circle, his face like a mask of darkness, was the least of my worries. The real danger was what had been summoned, what had been waiting for so long to break through into our world. As I reached the edge of the clearing, the trees around me seemed to shift, blocking the path. The shadows closed in tighter, and the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. I forced myself to keep moving, to push through the growing sense of dread that gnawed at the back of my mind. But then, something else changed. A sound. Not a rustle of the trees, not a whisper of the wind. This was something deeper, something coming from the ground itself, from the very earth beneath my feet. A low rumble, almost like a growl, reverberated through the forest. The ground trembled beneath me, sending a wave of fear crashing over me. The chanting resumed. It was louder now, almost deafening, reverberating in my skull, pulling me back, dragging me toward the center of the clearing. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of something rotten. I forced my eyes open, even as the weight of the darkness seemed to press down on me, suffocating me. That's when I saw it. In the distance, standing at the far edge of the clearing, was the symbol, the one I had found earlier, glowing ominously on the ground. The ancient rune, painted in dark, sticky red, was pulsing with an unnatural energy. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a doorway, a rift, and it was opening. The air around it shimmered, like the very fabric of reality was warping and stretching, bending under the strain of whatever was pushing through. The ground trembled again, more violently this time, and I felt the first real surge of terror course through me. This was no longer just a ritual, it was a summoning. A doorway was opening, a rift between worlds, and I was standing right in front of it. The chanting grew louder still, the voices rising in unison, echoing around me. They weren't human voices. There was something wrong with them. They sounded distorted, like they were coming from another place, another time. The man in the center of the circle continued to chant, his voice rising above the others, his hands still raised to the sky, as if he were controlling the very forces that were about to tear apart reality. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I had to stop this.
I remembered what Evelyn had said. The door, the gateway, had to be closed before it fully opened. But how? How could I close it? I wasn't a trained ritualist. I had no idea what I was doing. All I knew was that I had to act, or I would be consumed by whatever was on the other side. I reached for the protective charm Evelyn had given me. It was a small, ancient talisman, a smooth stone carved with runes of protection. She had told me to keep it on me, to use it if I needed to protect myself. But this was something far beyond what I could have ever imagined. The ground beneath me shifted again, and I felt a pull, like gravity itself was trying to drag me toward the symbol. It was as if the forest was alive, as if the land itself had a mind and was forcing me toward the rift. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling, and pulled out the charm. I didn't know what to do with it, but I had to do something. The air around the symbol was thick with power now, crackling with an energy I couldn't understand. The earth had become soft beneath my feet, like wet clay, and I felt myself slipping closer to the center. The symbols on the ground, the ones I'd seen earlier in the shelter, were all glowing now, burning with an unnatural light. The man in the center of the circle turned toward me. His eyes were wide, gleaming with an unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come," he said again, his voice thick with a twisted satisfaction. I was too close now. The gateway was fully open. I could feel it, a pulling sensation, a tugging at my very soul, as if the rift was trying to swallow me whole. I forced myself to take a step back, clutching the charm tightly in my hand, my mind racing for some solution. Evelyn had said to trust my instincts, but I wasn't sure what my instincts were telling me anymore. The chanting grew louder, the voices of the figures blending together into a single terrifying noise. The ground shook violently, and for a moment I thought I might lose my balance, fall into the rift. But then, something inside me clicked. I didn't know why or how, but I understood. The symbol, the rune, it had to be disrupted. I had to stop it from completing its pattern. It was like a puzzle, and if I could break it, I could close the door. With no more time to think, I ran toward the symbol, ignoring the dizzying sensation of the world spinning around me. The moment I stepped onto the edge of the glowing rune, everything around me seemed to stop. The chanting ceased. The world seemed to hold its breath. I placed the charm at the center of the symbol. For a second, nothing happened. I stood frozen, my heart in my throat, waiting for the moment of reckoning. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the symbol began to flicker and fade. It was as if the very air around me was breaking apart. The energy that had once been so thick, so suffocating, began to dissipate. The trees around the clearing groaned, their branches shaking violently, and the ground beneath me cracked open, sending a burst of dirt and debris into the air. The figures in the circle screamed, their voices distorted and panicked as the rift began to close. But it wasn't over. I could feel the pull, still there, faint but persistent, like something was fighting against the closing door, trying to break through. I gripped the charm tighter, my muscles screaming in protest, and focused all my will on forcing the door shut. The air grew cold, the world spinning faster. The trees bent as though they were alive, the wind howling like a beast in pain. I could hear the rift, like a massive tear in reality, a violent ripping sound. And then, with one final burst of energy, it was done. The silence that followed was deafening. The trees stood still, unmoving. The wind had stopped. The chanting had ceased. The glowing symbol was gone, leaving only the faintest traces on the ground, like an ancient scar that would never fully heal. I stood there, my legs shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. My head was spinning, my vision blurring. The figures in the circle had disappeared. The man was gone. And yet, I felt something in the air, a lingering presence. Something was watching me. I didn't dare turn around. I ran.
Hi, kids. Let me tell you a story about something strange that happened to me one late night. My name is Dax, and I live in a big, bustling city. I'm 29, work as a delivery driver, and have seen a lot of weird things. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that train ride. That night I was coming back from visiting my cousin Levi in the Bronx. It was close to midnight and the streets were quiet. Levi is a chef at a late-night diner, and he had made me some of his special mac and cheese to take home. I was tired but happy, thinking about how good it would taste when I got back to my apartment in Queens. I hopped on the train, and it was surprisingly empty. Normally, even at this hour, you'd find a couple of people catching a late ride, but this train was quiet, almost too quiet. There were only 3 other people in the car. The first was Mrs. Etta, an older woman I see sometimes in my neighborhood. She always carries a knitting bag and hums old jazz songs. She smiled at me and went back to her knitting. Next was a man in a brown jacket who looked like he was coming home from work. He was reading a book and seemed lost in his own world. Lastly, there was a young woman, probably a college student, sitting near the back scrolling on her phone. I settled into my seat, feeling the train hum to life as it left the station. For the first few minutes, everything was normal. I was about to close my eyes when a man stumbled into our car through the connecting doors. He looked to be in his late 20s, about my age, and wore a black hoodie with the hood pulled up. His name, as I later found out, was Milo. He wasn't walking straight. Instead, he clutched his stomach as if he was hurt or hiding something. His eyes were red, not like he had been crying, but like he hadn't slept in days. He slid into the corner of the car and hunched over, muttering to himself. At first, I thought he might just be tired or unwell, but then he started to cry, loud, gut-wrenching sobs that made everyone in the car glance at him nervously. Even Mrs. Etta paused her knitting. The sound of his crying filled the train, and it felt like the walls were closing in. The train stopped at the next station, and I expected him to leave, but instead, Milo jumped up and ran out of the train, screaming, "Why? Why did it have to happen?" He clutched his stomach tighter and kept yelling things I couldn't make out. I couldn't help but watch him through the window. He ran alongside the train, his face twisted in pain. When the train started moving again, he ran back inside, this time through a different door. Now, he was standing closer to me. He started talking, his voice shaky but growing louder. "Someone's got to pay for this," he said, over and over. The other passengers were frozen. Mrs. Etta had stopped knitting completely, her hands trembling. The man in the brown jacket slowly closed his book and sat up straighter. The young woman had stopped scrolling and was now gripping her phone tightly. Milo turned toward us, his eyes wide and filled with something I can only describe as rage mixed with sadness. "Y'all don't get it," he said, his voice breaking. "Tonight, you're gonna feel what I feel. All of you." My heart was pounding now. Milo kept clutching his stomach, and I noticed he was holding something. A dark object that looked like it could be anything. Was it a weapon? My mind raced. I didn't want to panic, but I also didn't want to stay close to him. When the train slowed down for the next station, I made up my mind. As soon as the doors opened, I grabbed my bag, bolted out, and ran up the stairs to the street. Behind me, I could hear Milo screaming, but I didn't turn around. When I got to the street, I stopped to catch my breath. The city felt so big and empty at that moment. I wanted to call someone, but my hands were shaking too much. I lit a cigarette, even though I was trying to quit, and waited for the next train. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake what had happened. I kept wondering about the other passengers. Were they okay? Did Milo do something after I left? The next day I checked the news and social media, but there was nothing about it. That night taught me a lesson. Sometimes it's better to trust your instincts and get out of a situation, even if you don't fully understand it. And kids, remember this. If you ever feel like something's wrong, it's always okay to leave. After I ran out of that train station, I stayed above ground for what felt like hours, even though it was probably just 20 minutes. My mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about Milo, the way he looked, the way he cried, and especially the way he yelled those chilling words. I thought about the 3 passengers I left behind. Mrs. Etta, the man in the brown jacket, and the young woman with her phone. I hoped they had gotten off the train at the same stop I did. But what if they hadn't? What if Milo had done something after I left? I lit another cigarette, not caring about the promises I had made to myself to quit. The smoke helped calm my nerves a little, but I couldn't stand still. I paced near the station entrance, peering down the steps every few seconds, expecting to hear sirens or see people running out in a panic. But nothing happened. Finally, I decided to take the next train. I couldn't stand there all night. My apartment in Queens was still a long way off, and the city, even though it's big and crowded, can feel strangely lonely when you're scared. When the train arrived, I hesitated before stepping inside. The car was nearly empty again, except for a couple of people sitting at the far end. I sat as far from them as I could, just in case. My hands were still trembling, and I kept my eyes glued to the doors, half expecting Milo to burst in again. The ride home was uneventful, but my mind was still spinning. I kept replaying everything that happened. Milo's bloodshot eyes, the black object in his hand, his heartbreaking cries. It wasn't until I finally reached my apartment and locked the door behind me that I felt a tiny bit safe. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was a message from Levi. "Hey, you okay? Heard something happened on the train last night. Some guy got arrested near your stop. You weren't there, were you?" My stomach dropped. I quickly searched for news about the incident. Sure enough, there was a small article about a man causing a disturbance on a late-night train. The article didn't say much, just that the man was detained after passengers reported his erratic behavior. No one was hurt, thankfully, but the police found him carrying a broken kitchen knife wrapped in a piece of cloth. The article mentioned something else, though, something that sent a chill down my spine. According to the police, Milo had been ranting about someone named Theo, his best friend who had been killed in a fight just hours earlier. Milo had blamed himself for what happened and in his grief had boarded the train, not knowing what to do or where to go. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. I didn't know what to feel. Relief that no one was hurt? Sadness for Milo and his loss? Or guilt for running away and leaving those other passengers behind? Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about Milo. The memory of his cries and his pain stuck with me. I started taking different routes home, avoiding that train line altogether. But the city has a way of reminding you of things you want to forget. About a week later, I saw Mrs. Etta near the bodega in my neighborhood. She was sitting on a bench, knitting like always. I hesitated before approaching her, unsure if she would remember me. "Excuse me," I said. "You were on the train that night, weren't you? With that man, Milo?" She looked up at me and smiled softly. "Oh yes, dear, I remember that poor boy, he was so lost." We sat together for a while and she told me what happened after I left. "When you got off, I thought about following you," she admitted. "But something told me to stay. That young man, Milo, you said his name was, he didn't want to hurt anyone, he was just broken." Mrs. Etta explained how Milo had finally collapsed onto the floor of the train, sobbing uncontrollably. The man in the brown jacket had quietly moved closer to him, speaking in a calm, steady voice. "He told Milo he understood what it felt like to lose someone," she said. "That he'd been through it too. I don't know if it was true or not, but it seemed to help. Milo stopped yelling after that, he just cried." When the train reached the next station, the young woman with the phone had called for help. By the time the police arrived, Milo had handed over the knife without any resistance. "They treated him gently," Mrs. Etta said, "like they could see how much pain he was in." Hearing her story made me feel a little better, but it also left me with questions. What if I hadn't run away? Could I have helped Milo somehow? Or would I have just made things worse? I guess I'll never know. It's been a few months now and life has mostly gone back to normal. But every time I step onto a quiet train, I think about that night, about Milo and the pain he carried, about how close we all were to something terrible happening. So kids, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Be kind to people, even when they scare you. You never know what someone else is going through. And always, always trust your instincts. Good night. Sure. Here's the rewritten story as a scary bedtime story for kids told in the first person. Hi, I'm Peter Cray, and this is a story I'll never forget. It happened when I was 11 years old during one freezing December when the snow outside was thick enough to crunch under your boots. My family had just moved to a small town called Glenbrook, a quiet place where everyone knew everyone else. My dad, James, was a baker. He made the best bread and pies in town, and my mom, Grace, stayed home to take care of me and my younger sister Emma, who was 8 at the time. Emma loved to sing and was always humming her favorite songs while helping Mom in the kitchen. I was more into reading adventure stories, though, and spent most of my time imagining myself as a hero. But that winter, things started to feel strange around our house. One evening, while we were eating dinner, someone knocked on the door. It was odd because we didn't know many people in Glenbrook yet, and the snowstorm outside made it unlikely anyone would visit. My dad answered, and there stood a man wrapped in a long, dark coat. "My name is Victor," the man said. He had a soft voice but spoke in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "My car broke down in the snow and I need a place to stay for the night. I'll be gone by morning." Victor didn't look like he belonged in Glenbrook. His face was pale, his eyes sharp, and he had an odd way of staring like he was looking through you. My dad, being the kind man he was, agreed to let him stay, even though something about Victor made me feel uneasy. Victor sat by the fire that evening, warming his hands. He told us little about himself except that he traveled a lot and didn't have a home. "The road is where I belong," he said, smiling slightly, but his smile didn't feel warm. Emma, being the curious one, asked if he had a family. Victor paused for a long time before saying, "Not anymore." That's when I noticed his hands. They were covered in scars like he had been in a fight, or several. He didn't eat much dinner and barely talked the rest of the night. Instead, he kept watching us. Not in a friendly way, but like he was trying to figure something out. I remember feeling a tightness in my chest, like something bad was about to happen. That night, after Victor had gone to the guest room, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the sound of the wind outside. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hall. They were slow and steady, like someone was trying not to wake anyone. I peeked out of my bedroom and saw Victor standing at the door to my parents' room. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at the closed door. I wanted to yell, but my voice caught in my throat. After what felt like forever, Victor turned and walked back to the guest room. I stayed up the rest of the night, heart pounding, until I finally fell asleep as the sun came up. The next morning, Victor was gone. He left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Thank you for your kindness." My dad shrugged it off and said, "Guess he's on his way." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that day, I told my friend Sam about Victor. Sam was the same age as me and loved scary stories as much as I did. He went pale when I mentioned Victor's name. "There's a man named Victor who travels around," Sam said. "My grandma told me about him. He's not just a regular man. People say he brings bad luck or worse." I laughed it off, trying to convince myself Sam was just trying to scare me. But deep down, I knew there was something to what he said. That night, another snowstorm rolled in. It was worse than the one before, with wind howling and snow piling up fast. I couldn't sleep again, partly because of the storm, and partly because of what Sam had said. Around midnight, I heard something outside, footsteps crunching in the snow. I looked out my window and saw a shadowy figure standing near the edge of the woods. It was Victor. He was staring right at our house, not moving. I ran to wake my dad, but by the time he got to my room, Victor was gone. "You're just imagining things, Peter," Dad said. But I knew what I saw. The next evening, We were all sitting in the living room when the power went out. Mom lit some candles, and Dad tried to keep us calm, but I could see he was nervous. The storm was still raging outside, and the house felt colder than it should have been. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. My dad froze. My mom whispered, "Who would be out in this storm?" He opened the door, and there was Victor smiling. "I left something behind," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The air seemed to get even colder. Victor looked around the room, his eyes landing on each of us. "I just need a moment," he said, but something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. Victor's gaze landed on Emma, and she whimpered, hiding behind my mom. "You have a lovely family," he said, his voice low and strange. My dad finally spoke up. "I think it's time for you to go, Victor." Victor didn't move. Instead, he smiled wider, and for the first time I noticed his teeth. They were sharp, like an animal's. That's when I grabbed the fire poker from beside the fireplace. "Leave us alone," I shouted, my voice shaking but strong. Victor turned to me, his eyes narrowing. For a moment I thought he was going to lunge, but then he laughed, a deep, chilling laugh. "You're braver than I thought," he said. Without another word, he turned and walked out into the storm. Victor never came back, but strange things started happening in Glenbrook. Cows were found dead in the fields, their bodies cold as ice. People whispered about a shadowy figure seen wandering the woods at night. We moved away the next spring, but I'll never forget Victor and the way he made our house feel colder than any winter ever could. So if a stranger ever knocks on your door during a snowstorm, remember my story, and don't let them in. Even though we moved away from Glenbrook, I couldn't stop thinking about Victor. I told myself it was over, but sometimes at night I would wake up, feeling as if someone was watching me. My room would feel colder than the rest of the house, and I'd hear faint footsteps, though there was no one there. One night, about a month after we left Glenbrook, I heard my parents whispering in the kitchen. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. "It's probably just the wind," my dad said, though he didn't sound like he believed it. "No, James," my mom whispered. "I saw him, standing in the yard. It was him, I'm sure of it." I froze. Was Victor following us? My chest tightened and I hurried back to my room, too scared to let them know I was listening. A week later, it happened again. This time, my dad found footprints in the snow around our house. They didn't lead to the door, though. They stopped right under my bedroom window. "Could be kids playing a prank," my dad said, brushing it off. But his face was pale, and he spent the night sitting in the living room with a bat in his hands. Emma, too young to understand the danger, kept asking, "When's Victor coming back?" He said I was lovely. Is he bringing me a present? I shuddered every time she mentioned his name. After that, strange things started happening in our new town. A neighbor's cat disappeared, and its collar was found on our porch. The streetlights outside our house flickered every night, though the ones down the block worked fine. And then, one night, Emma woke up screaming. "He was in my room," she cried. "Victor was here." My parents rushed to her room, but no one was there. The window was locked, and the snow outside was untouched. Still, Emma insisted she'd seen him, standing in the corner of her room, smiling at her with his sharp teeth. Desperate for answers, my parents took me and Emma to visit an old woman named Hester, who lived on the edge of town. People said she knew about strange things and could help with unusual problems. Hester was tiny and wrinkled, with eyes that seemed to see straight through you. She listened as my parents explained everything, nodding slowly. When they mentioned Victor, her expression darkened. "Victor is not a man," she said. "He's something much worse. He finds families and feeds on their fear. He won't stop unless you stop him." My dad, ever the skeptic, asked, "And how do we stop him?" Hester handed him a small pouch filled with herbs and a candle. "Burn this in your home tonight. It will drive him away, but only if you all stay together and show no fear." That evening, we followed Hester's instructions. My dad lit the candle and poured the herbs into the fire. The smell was strange and sharp, and the house filled with smoke. At first, nothing happened, but as the night wore on, the house grew colder. The lights flickered, and then the power went out entirely. We huddled together in the living room, my mom holding Emma tightly while I clutched the fire poker again. My dad stood near the window, staring out into the snowy yard. Then we heard it. A knock at the door. It was soft at first, then louder. Knock, knock, knock. "Don't open it," my mom whispered. My dad didn't move. The knocking continued, relentless. Knock, knock, knock. Then a voice came, low and smooth. "Let me in. It's cold out here." My dad gripped the bat tighter, but he didn't respond. The voice came again, louder this time. "I left something behind. Let me in, James." My heart pounded in my chest. How did Victor know my dad's name? The knocking stopped, but the air in the room grew heavy, like it was harder to breathe. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement by the window. Victor's face appeared, pressed against the glass, grinning. His teeth glinted in the faint candlelight, and his eyes seemed to glow. "You can't hide from me," he said. "You're all mine." Emma started crying, but my mom held her close, whispering, "Don't look at him. Don't listen." Victor began tapping on the window, his grin never faltering. "I can wait," he said. "I always wait." As the night dragged on, Victor's voice grew quieter, but the fear in the room didn't fade. My dad kept the bat in his hands, ready to fight if Victor tried to get inside. Finally, just before dawn, the candle burned out and the house grew silent. We waited, holding our breath, until the first light of morning crept through the windows. Victor was gone. We stayed in the house for a few more months, but my parents couldn't take it anymore. They sold the place and moved us halfway across the country. Even now, years later, I still think about Victor. Sometimes I dream about him, standing outside in the snow, his sharp teeth gleaming and his cold eyes staring straight at me. I don't know what he was or why he chose us, but I know this. If you ever hear a knock at your door during a storm, don't answer it. Some visitors are better left outside. And that, my friend, is the story of Victor. So, remember, no matter how cold it gets or how desperate someone seems, never let a stranger inside. You never know what they might be.